Is starting. Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 137 of the Millennia and Microcosm Kenneth Smith seminar. We've had Kenneth Smith seminars before Millennia and Microcosm, and we plan to have Kenneth Smith seminars after Millennia and Microcosm. So we've actually been at this Kenneth Smith discussion here on Meetup for considerably more than 137 weeks. But 137 has gotten us through most of chapter 5, chapters 1 through 5 of Kenneth Smith's forthcoming book, Millennia and Microcosm. It was previously published as excerpts, or as installments in a column called The End Times in the back of a magazine called The Comics Journal back around 1998, 1999, 2000. And he did it for the Millennium. Oh, is it meeting 200? Oh, yes, counting everything, it's meeting 200. Yeah, we've been at this for a while. So he published it then. He published it with the coming of the year 2000, and he treated it like a retrospective to say, the year 2000, the millennium, is a good time to think back. Donald's coming. Excellent. There's a quote that Kenneth Smith likes a lot from Goethe, the German poet and philosopher. Goethe says, anyone who cannot recount to himself the past 2,000 years of civilization lives a life that's aimless and drifting. And Kenneth takes that seriously, but he takes it a little further back than that. So in preparation for the year 2000, he wrote these columns to talk about the past, I'd say, 2,700, 2,800 years of European history. And he breaks it up into 3 epochs following the lead of Hegel. The first epoch is the ancient epoch, which includes the Greeks and the Romans in particular. The second epoch is the medieval epoch, and that's the one that we've entered now in our discussions with chapter 5. Chapters 5 through I don't know, the next 10 chapters or so are about medieval civilization. The first chapters were introductory. Chapter 4 was a very condensed discussion of the ancient epoch and its worldview. And then once we wrap up medieval civilization in, about another year and a half, we'll start into the final chapters of the book. The last 10 or so covers modern civilization. And the goal of this is very specific. What he's trying to do is he's suggesting an exercise that the Greeks talked about, Hegel talks about it, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Hannah Arendt talks about it. And it's as follows. It's very easy to assume we see the world objectively, because when we look at the world, it makes sense to us. We take that making sense for indicating that we're not missing anything important. We're just, when we learn new things, we think we're filling in details in a framework that's essentially correct. But the Greeks didn't think that was true. Hegel didn't think that was true. Kierkegaard, Nietzsche don't think that's true. Hannah Arendt doesn't think that's true. They say, what's happening instead is that we have developed a sophisticated group of ideologies in our head that has powerful interpretive value, and it has the ability to make any new information seem to fit within the framework that the brain has already selected for itself. But that framework is not objective, and it's not the truth. It's like looking in funhouse mirrors all your life, and you get to where you've corrected for the distortions you think, and you think this is pretty much how the world is. And the first time you see a real mirror that shows you the world the way it is, you say, well, that mirror is obviously distorted because it's not showing what I'm familiar with. What I'm familiar with must be, ipso facto, the truth. So Kenneth is saying this is like a trap. The way we see the world is like a labyrinth that we've constructed. Every time we think, every time we talk, every time we learn, every time we read, we're building out this mental labyrinth that is trapping us away from the real world. And the easiest way to see that that's true is to spend some quality time with a few other worldviews that are very different from ours, very different, but that also make sense in their own right, so that we learn that the making sense is not the important part. It doesn't justify.
Spend a week in with Archie Bunker.
Yes, right. The world makes sense to Archie Bunker. And so he therefore concludes that he's seeing the world the way that it must actually be. And it's only people who don't share his worldview to whom it's obvious that it,
Well, you do have this class element in America.
Yes. Yes. So what's happening in this book, I'm giving a little longer intro for James Medler. Hello. So the idea is that in this book, he's going to take us through three worldviews, and it's based on these three epochs of European history. Of course, the final epoch of European history has become the epoch of world history because of Europe's conquest of the world and imposition of its worldview upon everybody else. So he's going to take us in chapter 4. Yes, James, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Um, is this an apropos time to ask a question? Because I think it might be apropos.
We can start with one. I haven't quite
Um,
finished introducing it.
I apologize, but I think it might be apropos to ask this question for me anyway. What is meant, and when did the term Greco-Roman come about? Was that like in between Rome's take, like the Greeks and the Rome taking over from the Greeks from Greece?
Yes, so the term Greco-Roman dates to the Renaissance. It was people looking back at Greek and Latin literature, reconstructing the history of Rome and Greece, aside from the canned version that they'd been taught throughout the Middle Ages. They went back to the original sources and they discovered it was different than they thought it was. And there's a lot more Latin literature than there is Greek literature, and the Romans claimed to be representing or fulfilling Greek culture, and so they coined this term Greco-Roman. Now, one of the critiques that we've had since then is that the Romans weren't nearly as Greek as they claimed to be. Their value system was in some ways a complete inversion and betrayal of the Greek value system. But they dressed up, their gods as the Greek gods. They dressed up their culture as the Greek culture, and they pretended to be that there was continuity. So I would say that Greco-Roman is to actual Greek and actual Roman as Judeo-Christian is to actual Jewish and actual Christian, i.e., Christianity and Judaism have a lot of differences that are sort of blurred by the term Judeo-Christian in exactly the same way that Greek and Roman cultures have a lot of differences that are blurred by the term Greco-Roman. The blurring serves ideological purposes. The period of history we're talking about is roughly 800 BCE to roughly 500 CE. So the fall of Rome we're taking as the dividing line between the ancient and the medieval worlds. So we spent some time in the ancient worldview in chapter 4, and we spent quite a while in there. Chapter 4 is written very densely. Kenneth Smith has a dense, elusive style of writing. He uses his vocabulary very specifically to evoke previous discussions, other philosophers, even works of literature or art or music. He's constantly pointing at other philosophers and writers and creative people to get you to. So it acts sort of like a philosophy class when you read one of his books. If you don't try to read it fast, if you slow down, look at the references and say, okay, well, look, fine. He's referencing Thucydides. Let's go read some Thucydides. If you take that approach, you get a whole, instead of getting a single systematic philosophical ideology, which a lot of philosophers do, what you get is sort of an education in a wide variety of differing perspectives, which is what Kenneth's after. He wants us to see things from a lot of points of view. So in chapter 4, we spend a bunch of time digging into the ancient worldview to learn to see not the ancients as the modern caricature, the way we prefer to look at them as a promising but primitive prerequisite predecessor to our glorious selves. This is how moderns interpret the Greeks. We say, oh, look, they're dabbling in democracy. Isn't that cute? That's sweet. Oh, look, they're dabbling in science. Isn't that cute? We'll put them on a pedestal and say they're nice because they're sort of like us. They're like baby us. But of course, that's not the truth, right? The Greeks weren't baby anybody. They were the Greeks, and they had their own worldview. And most of the interesting parts of their worldview are things that when moderns look back on the Greeks, we completely miss. Aristotle can be telling us as clearly as he can something that's central to the ancient worldview, and we read that passage and completely miss the point of it. We translate everything into pragmatism and utility and all these modern values and assume that those are the things he must be talking about. The key example is in the Iliad when Achilles talks about how he had the choice of a long, safe, happy life or a short life of glory, and he chose immortal fame. The way the translators read it and translate it into English, and the way moderns read it generally is the way a modern person, it's the modern value system says, well, who wouldn't want to be be famous. That would be cool. Let's be famous. Maybe he'll make a lot of money. Maybe he'll get a lot of power. Maybe people will talk about him, and all those things are good things, and that must be why he did it. But of course, that has nothing to do with why Achilles did it. Achilles did it for ancient reasons that are difficult for moderns to understand. So we spent a bunch of time on chapter 4 working through that value system and how it works in their worldview. Now, for the last several months, we started into the medieval section. And in the medieval section in chapter 5, we're starting with a bunch of contrasts. We're explaining how, as the medieval worldview arose from within the ancient worldview, it was in very clear, direct opposition to the ancient worldview. They all the things that the ancients valued, the medievals thought were terrible. And the things that the medievals valued were things that the ancients thought were terrible. They flipped everything on its head. They've completely inverted their picture of the world. And they're doing that as a rejection, as a way to say, you know, at the time that the medievals, the proto-medievals are writing, the early church fathers, they're saying, Rome is so corrupt. They don't do anything they say they do. They do all these terrible things that they don't admit to. It's might makes right dressed up as philosophy. It's terrible. So everything that they stand for, but also everything they claim to stand for, is all bad. And we're throwing it all out, baby bathwater and everything. And we're taking a radically new approach to trying to design a political economy, a philosophy, a theology, and everything else. So that's what we're talking about in chapter 5. And what we learn from this exercise is how different the medieval worldview is from the ancient worldview. And in both cases, we're experiencing how different they are from our own worldview, the modern worldview. So the way he's constructed this book is when we get to, I don't know what chapter it's going to be, somewhere around 15 or so, he's going to switch to the modern worldview, and we'll finally be able to look at the worldview that we've always taken for granted, that we grew up in, that we think we understand, with new eyes. We'll be able to look at it the way an ancient would look at it, and we'll be able to look at it the way a medieval would look at it. And all kinds of things are going to jump out at us that we took for granted, like the fish that can't discover water because it's always in water. It's going to give us the chance to go, oh my God, we're swimming in water. This is the project that he's after in this book. And so the goal is not to say that any of these three worldviews is correct, but to say that every human worldview is limited. And what you don't want to do is turn a worldview into an ideology and be loyal to it and say, we absolutely want to defend this ideology. We want to make sure that other ideologies are crushed and that everybody looks at the world the way we do. We don't want to do that because we're missing so much of reality when we look from any single worldview. And so maybe what we want to do over the course of our lives after the exercise that this book takes us through is collect additional worldviews and ideologies, of which there are many throughout history, and kind of look for new angles on reality beyond the ones that we're familiar with. So this is a long intro, right? But this is the project. This is why we've been at it for 137 weeks. We'll be at it for, I mean, if I had to guess, I'd say another 200 or 300. It'll take a while to do this because Kenneth Smith describes, he says philosophy is different from all other subjects because other subjects give you something new to think about. Only philosophy gives you something new to think with. And so philosophizing, he says, is not something that comes naturally to the human brain. He says philosophizing is a lot like dislocating your joint so that you can move your arm in ways that it was never designed to do and reach things behind you in places that if it were in joint, it couldn't do. He says you're dislocating the joint of your mind and turning those critical faculties back around to look at yourself and how you've constructed your worldview, how your ideologies work, how you go along with distortions of reality so that it becomes something that you can choose to change if you want to, but at least understand. So that's the backdrop. That's where we are. The link that I've put in the chat points to points to chapter 5. I've quoted paragraphs from sentences 1 and 11 from 14. That's the first and last sentences, and that's where we're going to pick up our discussion. Last week, we spent a bunch of time talking about sentence 11. It was a wide, free-ranging discussion because sentence 11 is so juicy. But when we wrap up these two sentences, we'll start into paragraph 15 this week. So that's the backdrop. And I see we've got hands, so why don't we get started? Phil, why don't you come off mute and tell us what's on your mind?
I have a question about the timeline Kenneth Smith used, because I wonder whether he's going to talk about the new millennium, but the new millennium starts at 2001. That's the new century of the new millennium, not 1999. So, did he make a mistake by saying that, or was he because not not being in the right timeline, he's sort of saying he's anticipating the future, or he's just actually looking backwards and show you what led up to that? Because those are two very different concepts. He might have said, looking back at the history of time or something, then you would say, okay, now we're clear. But the way he said it, we're going to look at the new millennium. Well, he's anticipating. Is he leading? If that's true, is he also not caught up in ideology? Because how do you anticipate that without the logos of ideology that projects you into the future? Could you answer that question? Because it's very interesting how he coined the new millennium when it hasn't yet arrived.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, so there's an interesting essay written by paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould. If you haven't spent any time reading Stephen Jay Gould's essays, you should pick up at least one of his books. He's a hell of a writer. He does that thing that Connections, that TV series Connections did, where you look at odd details of history that you would think are completely unrelated. They're interesting, but they have no bearing on each other. And then it turns out they're deeply related to each other, and they're maybe even cause and effect or two different effects from the same cause. He has a great essay style. So he wrote an essay about the year 2000, Stephen Jay Gould did, in which he said, yes, by some reckonings, the new millennium starts in 2001. Says, but those aren't the only possible reckonings, and they're not even necessarily the reckonings with the greatest argument in favor of them. And he says, one of the things about the calendar, the way that we run it, typically when we extend the Gregorian calendar backwards, what's called the proleptic Gregorian calendar, is that we have a tendency to go from the current era, going backwards, we then go to one from before the current era. What happened to zero? This is bad math, right? You can't do math if you drop zero out of your timeline. It screws everything up. So there is an alternative proleptic Gregorian calendar, which is gradually gaining in popularity among people who have to do date time calculations like me, in which we insert the year zero and we stop saying CE and BCE, and instead we just use positive and negative year numbers. And so now you can do math with years and calculate years correctly. And if you do that, then the current millennium would be, or I guess the previous millennium, right? Let's say the first millennium would have been 0 through 999, not 1 through 1000. And by that reckoning, the new millennium starts in the year 2000. So Stephen Jay Gould talks about this, and he says the point is it doesn't really matter, right? What the years are doesn't have, these dates aren't handed down by the sun or the moon. We've just arbitrarily applied them backwards. And the history of calendar making is also a history of really big fumbles, grotesque errors in the way that people have tried to calculate these dates and times. So he says don't get too hung up on it. But as far as your more philosophical question, yeah, he's saying if we're worried about our future, right, which people were anticipating the Y2K crisis, and he was writing about that in chapter 1. He says then the way to understand it is not to live in this kind of narrow slice of the present that moderns are obsessed with. Now, do, go. What's the next thing? We really want to, follow Goethe's advice and look backwards to figure out, well, how the hell did we get here? And if we know how we got here and what the big energies are coming into the present, it'll change the way we look at the future.
Well, I mean, I like your explanation, but to me, Hegel sounds better because the owl of Minerva does not take flight until dusk. So that's looking backwards to, in a sense, anticipate what's forward. So that seems like Hegel to me. So I'll leave it at that.
It is very Hegelian, yes. Hi, Sharon. Welcome to the call. I'm just
Thank you.
drop in the link again and the sentences that we'll be getting to shortly. We did an introduction for James Medler, kind of explaining what we're doing for the last 137 weeks. So he's got the background about what we're doing. And as last week, we'll do but this time a quicker look at sentences 11 and 1 from paragraph 14, and then we'll start into paragraph 15. But first, questions and answers. So Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, it's something, not really being a scholar, but something I noticed when I started to explore historical literature. You know, for example, I was reading the famed Icelandic sagas. What's so interesting about the Icelandic sagas, that it might be the first large body of literature which was the product of ordinary people. We go to Europe, we find that the literature's a clerical class or otherwise who are catering to the aristocracy. And ordinary people are often seen as the butt of jokes. But you have this large body of literature, and it's taking seriously the conditions of ordinary people. But, you know, I was reading the literature, I started to notice, well, the interesting thing that is on the gut level, say these Vikings, are no different than Japanese. On the gut level, their gut reactions, their real visceral reactions to life. But what is very different are the values which are insubstantial, like, for example, moral values. For example, in our culture, you would say you can't eat babies. That's our value. But factually, you can. And in some cultures, they do eat people. And when you're talking about the lens that the culture sees itself, it seems to be these sort of values which, for whatever reason, have been created over time. And different cultures aspire to different values. For example, famously, the Japanese thought suicide was a really good way of restoring your honour, whereas, say, the Christian West would say, oh, that's a really wicked thing to do. That's a low thing to do. Again, it's a value which is above our ordinary set of physical facts. And this is something which, for most people, is not well understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it's interesting. Anthropology as a discipline is quite young. It's only really 100 plus years old. There were people trying to do anthropology in the 19th century, but they had a very hard time not imposing their own value system on the people they were studying. And I think modern anthropology doesn't really start until you get this core value in anthropology that says you really have to set aside your own value system if you're going to study and write up a monograph on some other culture. Because as long as you insist your value system is the only correct one, you'll be incapable of learning what their value system is and whether it works for them. There might be reasons why they act the way they do that are excellent reasons. They might know more about living in their circumstances than we can. But as long as we insist that we're right and they're wrong, we'll be incapable of learning that. So on the one hand, it's a young science. It still hasn't fully penetrated popular culture. People are still getting used to the idea of, there being different value systems and different cultures that are legit.
I'll just add that I clashed with Les Allen, of course, as I always do on Saturday night, by claiming that the thing archaeologists will discover is widespread evidence of cannibalism in pre-agricultural peoples. It seems the sort of the restriction on cannibalism, it's something that really takes hold in post-agricultural people. And Les, oh, he belittled me and, said, oh, yeah, you're so completely wrong, about these, these cavemen, or whatever you like to call them, pre-agricultural people. I don't know. It's just that this is something which, from the year dot, when I started reading about, the old Stone Age and stuff like that, you do find this distasteful mention. They don't actually, originally they didn't talk much about it, but of course, when they go and investigate, ancient human bones, they find, they believe there's a lot of cases where people have been gnawing on them. There's a
Yeah,
lot of evidence of cannibalism, but the modern mind cannot accept that. They
they
have a
find
very
tool marks.
idealistic picture of how the cavemen were living in their caves.
Right, right. And we're still learning what the balance is on these things, but there are all kinds of possible reasons why it could have been advantageous. Um, and it doesn't necessarily mean in all cases that someone was killed in order to eat them, but it could mean that if we're talking Paleolithic Europe during the Ice Age, there aren't a lot of places to live. You're competing with cave bears, particularly. You're trying to drive, and cave lions. You're trying to drive them out of the caves and take over the cave yourself, because the rock and earth is a massive insulator for you that gives you a chance to survive in what would otherwise be a hostile environment. And in that environment, there's probably a great deal of due diligence that your culture has to adopt to avoid doing things that lure back predators. Because I mean, cave bears were huge and fierce. Cave lions were huge and fierce. One of them smells meat and comes back. It could be the death of a number of the members of your tribe. So I've read some speculation that says that in some cases, during the Ice Age in particular, they may have practiced cannibalism on the dead, specifically to ensure that all of the meat was disposed of. There was no odor to summon back predator, and then it was the bones that you buried, because now it was safe to it wouldn't attract a predator. This is all, at this point, it's all speculation why it's happening. Yeah, James, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Does anyone here think it might also be possible, even though maybe they didn't know back then, there is a certain disease that you can get by eating human flesh, that maybe perhaps when they would let someone, a cadaver, be in their presence, that it would cause sickness, so they thought, okay, we got to eat this right away.
It could be that. It could certainly be that. There are so many. Also, burying the dead is spectacularly difficult when all the ground is frozen. We're talking prior to 10,000 BCE, 12,000, 15,000. We go back into that period. There's still ice and glaciers all over Europe, and so people are going to have strange adaptations. The other thing that's important about this, I'd say, if I were on the call with Liz, I'd just caution her that this is a golden age for, paleontology, the study of early human remains in particular. And we're learning dramatic new things every single year. And every single year there are huge breakthroughs. And so it's dangerous to generalize. We don't know what we're going to find next. So we know that there are instances of cannibalism, for sure. We don't know why, but we know there are. Anyway,
Well, the question was, it was widespread.
we don't know. I mean, our sample size is so small. We're still figuring it out.
Depends on how hungry people were.
It might depend on that. But again, the cannibalism might have had nothing to do with appetite. It might have had to do with disposing of the dead, to avoid summoning predators, to avoid causing disease. There could be a variety of reasons. And they haven't left us enough evidence to explain why they did it in those cases. So we'll learn. We'll figure it out.
I see a modern mindset there with a convenient world of KFC and McDonald's, which weren't there years ago.
They weren't there years ago. No, they certainly weren't. Now, it's modern hunter-gatherer cultures like the Kwakiutl of the Pacific Northwest coast. We know from Franz Boas's Kwakiutl ethnography that they had a cannibal ritual that was all about saying, you can't be an adult in our culture until you spend some time away from the tribe trying to survive on your own in the woods. And then you have to come back wearing a mask and outfit like a crazy person, like a cannibal. And we'll take you through a ritual in which you will rediscover why we don't eat each other, why we have to help each other, why you have to have solidarity with your tribal members. And then at the culmination of the ceremony, the Kwakiutl, who's on the verge of becoming an adult, passes through a womb, effectively, it's carved in wood, passes through, comes out the other side, removes the mask and costume of the cannibal, and puts on the clothing of an adult member of the Kwakiutl. Now they're today, they say their name is the Kwakwaka'wakwa, but you won't find that book under that name. The Franz Boas book is Kwakiutl ethnography, and so what it shows is it's not just agricultural societies that remember cannibalism and have prohibitions against it and human sacrifice. We see those things among the Greeks as well, old myths and rituals and stories. But even modern hunter-gatherers have this. And so again, one wonders whether it was relative to specific conditions in the past. Hard to say. I know, Stephen, in the part of the world you're living in Australia, you're closer to Borneo and are probably much more aware of it than most Americans are. Most Americans have the foggiest idea where Borneo might be or what people are like there. But as you know, and maybe not all the other people on this call, there's cannibalism certainly in historical times in Borneo and in some of the Pacific Islands. So
quite a lot of them, actually.
Yeah. So it didn't all go away in the past.
Hawaii as well.
Hawaii as well. Yes. Anyway, I'm gonna move us on to Phil's question, but thanks, Stephen. Come off mute, Phil. Tell us what's on your mind.
Stephen's question led me to thinking about something else. I'm not quite sure how related it is, but it reminded me of last Saturday's meeting I had on Plato's Plato's whatever it was like uh uh not not his whatever, but anyway, we had a discussion, and I mentioned in the discussion, because we were talking about Crete at the time, uh and uh and they were talking about how civilization developed and all that kind of stuff, and I said, I made a comment. It seems like whenever you have human beings and you start a civilization, there almost seems to be a necessity for indoctrination to keep the civilization together. Now, we usually think of indoctrination as like this negative thing, you're brainwashing people. But it's kind of true. I mean, human being desperately needs indoctrination to, in a sense, harmonize individuality of things into a system that is a cooperative in some sense. And so I was saying the problem with indoctrination is that you develop ideology, a logos, and in some sense, the logos not only produce the good things, I mean the harmony, but it produces divisiveness. Because to me, indoctrination has a dialectic for the good and the not so good. Because the people who see and learn how to be wise in an indoctrinated system could see the negative side and say, well, no, I'll just go against the system. I'll be conniving. And instead of being a philosopher king, I'll be the tyrant, that sort of thing. It just seems like there's a double edge indoctrination. And any society, therefore, is in a sense, successfully in one system or not. is, in a sense, we're all Manchurian candidates. I mean, we think of like, oh, those are the bad guys from North Korea, whatever, okay? But in some sense, we are just as indoctrinated as anybody else, supposedly in a positive way, but not necessarily, you know? And you could see how the indoctrination is falling apart in the United States. There's conflicts now. I mean, many people are seeing supposedly, hey, the devious way, it's actually better. And maybe that's what tears it apart. And I was thinking, when Stephen said about the average people, in our system, as is developed in a doctrinated system, the average person is the 99% of the population, because the 1% owns 50% of the profit, the wealth. So, so the uh, sort of poor people are uh, the downtrodden. That's 99% of our population. No wonder there's riots in the streets. So, because we are in a system governed by logos, and it's the wrong logos at this point. Okay, so that I thought I would. I think that I think the group didn't like what I said, but that's because they were indoctrinated by Plato already. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you, Stephen, for reminding me of my thought about that. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. James, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, just in response, Phil, and I think also Rick, you'll like this too, because I'm gonna kind of try and bring this back to some martial arts philosophy here. Um, and everyone knows the famous movie Karate Kid, wax on, Daniel-san, wax off, Daniel-san, and everyone might know the famous movie with recent flick. I can't remember the name, but Jackie Chan, Jet Li, forget everything, learn everything, know everything, forget everything, unknow everything, have no way, have a way, get indoctrinated a little bit here and there, get undoctrinated a little bit here and there when such and such indoctrination no longer serves its purpose for you and or society. Is that maybe what you're going for, Phil?
Got to come off mute, Phil. Phil, you're on mute.
No, that's not what I was thinking. When I brought that up, somebody said, in support of me, he said, like the early civilization was it was established by Cain, who killed Abel. So that had a bad start. I said, well, I don't need your argument. Thank you for your argument. I said, just think of the dialectic. Anytime you have one thing, you have the opposite. And the dialectic is a dynamic system. So you build a system that's based on money, there's going to be people who wants more money rather than sharing. I mean, it's like there's ways to get around it. I mean, I guess you don't want to say, oh, we just want a bunch of really stupid people who's not going to be clever enough to, in a sense, be devious. They're just straightforward, honest people. But on the other hand, you need progress. You need clever people to think about new ideas. But once you have that, then there are people who didn't think that's such a good idea, so they're going to go the opposite way. So that's why I was thinking, like building an education system is already in many ways a system of indoctrination. Hopefully, if you build it correctly, it helps to build a quality indoctrination for goodness, but not necessarily so. There's going to be people who say, well, this is not for me. because I want more money, or whatever it is. So in some sense, uh, society is going to always be a problem. What are you going to do? I guess you're going to catch the criminals and deport them. I suppose that you're going to be like Donald Trump. Okay, that's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. So kind of where I'd like to take that is I want to bridge from what Phil and James are talking about to sentence 11 in the text of paragraph 14. I'm watching Sharon thinking, boy, I was just seconds away from her going, how about the text? Can we go back to the text? One of Sharon's roles on our calls is to help steer us back towards the topic at hand. But in this case, I think the bridge is an easy one, because in sentence 11, what he's talking about is an implication of what Phil and James are talking about, which is this issue with indoctrination, the way that a culture, the process of acculturation can make it so that the world seems only one specific certain way, even though it's not, and that can blind us to other possibilities. On the one hand, that helps to create what the Greeks called the cosmos, a culture that can act as an organism and isn't always fighting against itself. But on the other hand, it means that because people share the same assumptions, they'll share the same blind spots, and it'll be hard for that culture to avoid making certain mistakes that are sort of baked into its worldview. So what the Greeks imagine, and what kind of Hegel to some extent, but Nietzsche more, I think, and Arendt and Kenneth Smith certainly advocate, is on the one hand, you need the acculturation to finish this unfinished animal. When we're born, we're not like a young horse that gets on its feet almost immediately. we're clearly not fully baked. And it's not just physically that we're not fully baked, although that's the emphasis in the modern world, and mentally, and in terms of, what is the most important word of the ancient Greek worldview, sophrosune. In terms of sophrosune, we're not baked at all. I mean, a baby has no idea what's good for it. Has a handful of reflexes that are useful, and after that, I mean, anybody who's tried to raise a toddler and keep them out of light sockets and hot stoves knows what I'm talking about. They're just, the endless curiosity is also a danger to their survival. So we need this acculturation to complete create a complete worldview, a human culture. It doesn't have to be the human culture or the right human culture, but at least a human culture needs to be created in the mind of this juvenile who's growing up towards adulthood. But as the Greeks wanted, philosophically, as traditional Okinawan martial arts and other martial arts from Asia talk about, the goal of getting to black belt is not to be done. It's to realize that everything you've learned so far has merely prepared you to learn. And that the point now is to recognize that it's not about finish lines and trophies. It's about becoming a lifelong student and learning to open your mind to new possibilities. So the old saying in traditional Okinawan martial arts is that a black belt is just a white belt that's been worn by a student who's been practicing so long his belt is very dirty, and he's committed to being a student for the rest of his life. You see this in the Greek philosophy as well. He's talking about in sentence 11. He says, and I know we did this last week. I'm just going to do it briefly for James because James wasn't here last week. Men have a right. This is Kenneth Smith writing, by the way, and this sentence is a classic example of the density of his writing. There is a lot going on here. There are a lot of loaded terms, and the more you work with Kenneth Smith, the more you start to recognize the terms. They just jump out at you. Men have a right and a responsibility to exercise the virtuosity of their ultimate insight and judgment for themselves. That's the first half of the sentence. And there's a dialectic right there in the first few words. They have a right, which is a kind of freedom, but they also have a responsibility, which is a duty, which is the opposite of a freedom. They have a freedom and an anti-freedom at the same time to exercise this virtuosity he's talking about. Not only are we free to, we are obliged to. And he means that not in some sort of abstract moral way, like God says so or the law says so. He's saying the Greeks believe you can't become a fully human being until you take responsibility for developing your capacity for insight and judgment If you merely parrot whatever your ideologies tell you, or whatever the crowd tells you, or whatever you learned in school, you're not yet a person. You're more of a symptom of other people who have passed on their ideas into you. That's just the formative stage, the sort of larval stage of a human being. To get to the adult stage, you have to use that training to raise yourself up to the point where you can start creatively judging things and evaluating things and looking more deeply for deeper insights that weren't available to you when you were just coloring inside the lines. You have to learn to become someone who draws coloring books for other people, not just someone who fills in coloring books that other people have created for you. So there is this dialectic there. And without that dialectic, the ancient Greeks believed you never became an individual, right? To be an individual, you have to transcend your culture. You have to transcend your training. You have to transcend your ideologies. Otherwise, you're just a symptom of them. And that's not an individual, right? That makes you disposable. Then you're basically generic, and any one of you will do nicely. You do. It's like if you're trying to put together a committee that represents a large population, and a bunch of the members of the population are in large institutions, and those institutions impose certain requirements that everybody's going to vote for certain things. You might as well only have one vote from each institution, because if you let all the people from the institutions vote, it's pointless, right? They're all going to say the same thing. They've all been forced to by the institution that they're a member of. So you get 100 votes, but it's meaningless. You might as well have just had the one. The one vote gives you the perspective that you were missing. The other 99 votes are just parroting what's already been said. So to get beyond that, you have to do what the Greeks are talking about in the beginning of the sentence. You have to really develop your insight and judgment to the levels of virtues, and try to make yourself into a virtuoso who specializes in nuanced, tasteful, experienced, open-minded, but also critical judgment and creative insight. With those things, you then are in a position where you can exercise them meaningfully in the world. But the second half of sentence 11 is a different dialectic. It says, being all the while in the hands of the daimonic powers that are their ultimate and intuitive life energy. Right? So the first part looks like it's very freedom oriented, despite the responsibility being a kind of duty. But the second part, and the first part is also talking about individuation and becoming a real person. But the second part is really nails home this Greek perspective on the human psyche, where they're saying, on the one hand, you are free to act in the world, but on the other hand, that freedom is constrained by your own character. Certain things make sense to you. Certain things don't make sense to you. Certain things you'll tend to notice. Certain things you'll tend to overlook. Certain things you want. Certain things you don't want. All of this arises from ethos, from the character within the human being. And in that sense, the exercise of the free will is the exercise of a dependent will that imagines that it's free. At all times, we are acting in accordance with our character. We're not able to do otherwise, according to the Greeks. Our character is the source of the good parts, the bad parts, the ugly parts, the whole shebang. And so the first half of this sentence seems to be talking about free will and creating yourself. The second half seems to be talking about determinism and not being a free agent in the world and merely being a symptom of your character. But they're put together into the sentence to create a larger dialectic that represents the Greek perspective on human ethos. And the larger dialectic is that they're both true at the same time. And it's like ethos anthropoi daimon, character is fate, from Heraclitus, right? So if we want to change our fate, we have to change our character. And therefore, the right and responsibility to exercise the virtuosity of ultimate insight and judgment for yourself that's talked about in the first half changes its meaning once we've read the second half, when we realize that what we're supposed to be judging and being insightful about is our own character, so that we can act and change ourselves and cultivate a better character than the one we have today. This is very familiar to traditional martial artists. They talk about this a lot. That you are trying to groove in new habits. You're trying to practice things that don't come naturally to you, but you wish that they did. And the way that you get them to come naturally to you when they don't right now is to practice them over and over and over until you've done them so many times that they do come naturally. And at the point where that happens, you have altered your character. Your character now makes it easy for you to do those things that previously were hard. So character is malleable, but it's hard to change. But you have a right and a responsibility to change it. And through changing it, to improve your insight and judgment over time, including improving your insight and judgment about your own character and your ability to change it. There's feedback loops within feedback loops and dialectics within dialectics in this sentence. This is really a reformulation of Heraclitus's ethos anthropoi daimon, using different words. And this is setting up the discussion of religion, which is what follows in paragraph 15, and which we're going to kick off in sentence 1 in a moment. So this is why I belabored this for a moment. Is you know the opening of sentence 1. I've cut off the first few words to focus on the juicy part. The roots of religion in human nature and the human condition. This is the ancient Greek perspective, that religion exists to help solve the problem that human beings don't have sophrosune, the way cheetahs do, the way oaks do. That instead we have this ethos within us that is malleable and can learn, and that other people can change, but also we can change, and that can both be shackles upon us, but also be our best hope for freedom, depending on how we relate to it. So what we're saying, what Kenneth is saying, that the Greeks are saying in the first part of sentence 1, is that this is why religion exists. The Greeks thought the religion is needed specifically to point people at their inner structure and at the problems that it poses, both them as individuals and us as a society and as a species, so that it can then propose a value system that says, here are your rights and your responsibilities, and here's how you need to work with this sharp tool inside you to develop it into something better than what you were born with, because it wants to grow, it wants to develop, it wants to unfold new order, just like the acorn wants to become an oak. But the acorn knows it wants to become an oak, whereas you don't know what you want to become. It could be anything. So you need insight and judgment to evaluate where you are now, what your possibilities are, and what habits you need to be working on to move in that direction. It said he's basically saying in sentence 1 that the Greeks believed that this was a religious duty, a sacred duty, to wrestle with these problems inside ourselves. And thus, the ancient Greek reaction to the statement that all men are born equal would have been to laugh and cry at the same time and say, dear God, you're just papering over the biggest problem in human existence, which is these issues of freedom and unfreedom within us are so much more powerful than that and more complicated and fraught. And people need real understanding of what they are if they're going to have some hope of doing something useful with it. And so that's why the Greeks made it a sacred thing instead of something you just get for free by being born modern. James, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm wondering, could you please, Rick, comment on how far off we'd be on these subjects now in our learning, knowledge, wisdom, information, culture, that sort of thing, and where we're at in this study today and in the past couple of weeks, when it comes to the fire at the Library of Alexandria burning down, which I think was an arson, but that's just my personal opinion. But anyway, yeah.
So yeah, as far as where we are today on these things, this is one of those things where I'm not going to give a straight answer. I'm going to give an answer in the context of this book and say, well, what would the ancients say about where moderns are on this? Or what would the medievals say about where moderns are on this? And the ancient one I can do with some confidence because we've spent 100 some odd sessions going through the ancients. The medievals we're just getting started on, but I'll give it a shot anyway. So the ancients would say, these issues of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that Jefferson says are inalienable rights. You've got them for free. You've already passed the finish line before you've left the starting gate. Don't worry your pretty little head about it. Just get on with your life and do practical things. But the Greeks would say that is a betrayal of everything that makes us human. They'd say, "Wow, it sounds like the Romans are speaking again." To claim to have solved in the easiest way possible by being just born with it the solutions to what the Greeks considered the most difficult problems. They'd say, people should spend their lives studying these problems in themselves and each other and working up strategies and practicing them for how to live a fulfilling life, how to become a free individual who can contribute to society, and how to decide what ought to make us happy, and to pursue that instead of kind of short-term quick fixes. And I say that everybody else on the call already knows this about me, except maybe Elle is also new to the call. Now, I come from an alcoholic family. I was born with it on both sides, going back multiple generations. All the adult members of my family for at least 3 generations have spent time, sometimes their entire lives, in the bottle. So I've never, spent any time in the bottle. That's an experiment I don't need to run. It's clear I've got the gene, so I don't touch it. But where that's relevant here is that it might make me happy to pick up a bottle and then never stop drinking for the rest of my life, in the same way that it made all these other members of my family happy. But it won't make me wise or good or fulfilled or a healthy example of a human being to do this thing that makes me happy. And these kinds of issues of happiness that leads to sophrosune, i.e. health, or happiness that sacrifices sophrosune for short-term payoff. These distinctions to the Greeks were everything, but in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, they're nothing. They're not even addressed. And so by telling people you don't have to worry about happiness, just go ahead and pursue it, which is effectively what we do in our Declaration of Independence, we are telling people to give up at the outset of the greatest game there is of life. Don't even try. Just don't even think about it. Kenneth Smith sometimes says moderns are the least philosophical kind of person that has ever existed in the history of the world, because all of the big questions we assume are answered for free easily right out of the gate. Nobody else assumed that. The medievals don't assume that. The medievals assumed the struggle to figure out what to do and to overcome temptation to try to do the right thing, even though you don't want to, is the greatest struggle of all. This is for 1,000 years in Europe. This is this worldview that happiness is a very difficult issue, and that life and liberty are difficult issues. This was the dominant worldview before the Renaissance and the rise of modernity, certainly among the ancients likewise. So that's what they would say about moderns. And of course, what we would say is, haha, you're wrong. We're modern. We know better than you do. You're the primitive versions of us, and our answers are right and your answers are wrong. So maybe maybe individually people might feel like studying philosophy or something like that, but they don't have to. They can do whatever they want. They're free. Period. The end. There's nothing more to see here. Kenneth would also add this, though. He'd say people will give non-homogeneous answers because modernity is a process, not just an epoch. It's a process of breaking down the surviving fragments of older value systems. So there's bits of medievalism still floating around within modernity. There, like the idea of chivalry or the pursuit of excellence. And there's bits of the ancient worldview still floating around inside modernity. You see some of it in science, the belief that nature matters and that we should study nature, and in other places as well. You see it in the Olympics. You see some survival of the idea of people striving to make themselves better than they started out. But these things are, Kenneth Smith would say, they are out of sync with the larger culture, the larger modern culture of the great world economy, which is trying to render everything down to countable value, to money. Once it's removed all other forms of value and everything's money, then we win, right? This is the rat race that we're all trapped in. Go, get, collect. So yeah, this is, this would be Kenneth Smith's line. He'd say, look at what the ancients say about about the modern perspective. Look at what the medievals say about the modern perspective, and then ask yourself again, what does it look like now? But generally speaking, in the modern world, religion is a matter of free personal preference, right? You can go to whatever church you want to, right? Religions are protected in that way in the modern world. And the assertion within that is sort of an anthropological assertion by default, but it wasn't intended as such. It was intended as a way to stop fighting religious wars against each other and to say, you know, fighting religious wars gets in the way of making a profit. We would really like to remove that element of existence. So we're going to say, go to whatever church you want. It's your business. It's not my business. And whatever you do in that church is between you and God and your fellow churchgoers, but has no larger relevance outside of that. And in
That
this
includes
sense,
Church of Satan, does it?
yes, yes. In the United States, there have been lawsuits. It includes the Church of Satan, any church, right? They're all churches. They're all religions. And the implication is that the value content of religion is so unimportant to life and to success that it doesn't matter which one you pick. This is the official legal economic position on religion. There's no distinction between them that matters. Not to the economy, not to the survival of modern industrial countries. And so what it really shows the way that, as Kenneth Smith and Hegel argue, when modernity arose, it overthrew the value system of the medievals. In the value system of the medievals, God was on top and everything should be aligned with God and God's will and God's message to us and the salvation. What the moderns did is they chucked God out of the throne and they stuck him at the bottom of the value hierarchy. And you don't get much closer to the bottom than literally nothing you talk about there matters to the governance of our societies, which is the official legal position. We say it's important and it's precious and it matters, except in that, you can pick anyone you want and it doesn't really matter. So this is, I bring this up because the ancient perspective that he's saying here is the exact opposite. The ancient perspective says, human nature and the human condition have such an enormous problem that we need religion to address the problems of human nature and human condition. And if we don't do that, we may not survive. And if we survive, we may just have miserable, sick lives all the way through. That we need religion to teach us how to take responsibility for ourselves and how to engage in anthropoculture, to cultivate ourselves, to become better people tomorrow than we were yesterday. This is and the implication, for those who've been on these calls before, is that to the Greeks, only people engaged in exercising the virtuosity of their ultimate insight and judgment, only people who carry out that right and responsibility are qualified to govern societies. Because those are the only people who are behaving like adult human beings. People who don't do that, who just do whatever they want, make themselves happy. Or conversely, people who only do what they're programmed to do, who follow their ideologies and systems, climb this corporate ladder and so on. The ancient Greeks believed those aren't adults, regardless of what their body might be capable of doing. Doesn't matter what their age is. If they don't engage in that struggle with their own nature and their own condition, to try to, if they don't take all of their assumptions with more than a grain of salt, with a truckload of salt, if they're not questioning themselves and their perspectives and struggling to become better, then why would you let them vote? They're not a person yet. They're still a larvae. This is the ancient perspective. And that therefore, religion, as the ancients conceive of it, is a tool for helping larvae grow into adult human beings who are qualified to govern. And if that's true, you certainly couldn't dispose of it or treat them all as interchangeable, treat religion as that's between you and God and it's a hobby for Sunday mornings, because whether you have adult human beings capable of governing is not a light issue. That's your survival in a nutshell. So to the ancients, religion is the most important thing, right? And for them, it's tied up with nature. For moderns, it's the least important thing. It's like whether you prefer Coke or Pepsi, or whether you prefer vanilla or chocolate. That's between you and your grocer. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, well, the clash of values is a problem. You know, you're saying that there was a very sort of laissez-faire attitude to values. Yeah, it was, you can go and have your values, whatever values. The only thing that matters is commerce, money. And, you know, they started talking about multiculturalism. In other words, they believed within a single state, you could have a whole load of groups who have very distinctly different values. And that this would work. Well, one big problem is groups like money. And there's a lot of government money to be had. And all these various groups now are competing for the government money. And this is a question where your value group matters, because it becomes a question of how much the government hands out. So, you know, Rudyard Lynch, you know, it's something I didn't think about, but he said the thing between the Republicans and the Democrats is actually class warfare. They have very different ideas, and both sides figure the government money is theirs. The government should be, you know, spending to line our pockets, and the other side says, no, the government should be spending that sort of ends up lining our pockets. And like I said, 20 years ago, I saw a little note about this growing rift between the Republicans and Democrats, that it was turning into sort of like armed camps. And now that was shocking to me. I had grown up in, you know, a high points of Western economic civilization, the post-war era. You know, there was no horizons. They were landing people on the moon. And things are not, the pace of technological advance isn't so great in qualitative terms as it was, say, around the year 1900, yeah. And everyone's, you know, a lot of people, particularly the left, believe that, oh, yeah, progress, material progress just happens. You only have to wait. You know, the cog's going around that produces progress. But you look in ancient history, Greco-Roman culture was very technically progressive at one stage. New things have been created, new inventions, and then that all ground to a halt. So actually, looking at most of history, the periods of non-progress probably outnumber the periods of technical progress. You know, currently there's a lot of people who think, oh, do whatever you like. You know, there's just going to be more power and more money to paper over the cracks. Problem solved. But yeah, this is what is exactly now is a huge value conflict in America between different classes that have very different ideas about things. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, part of what we see here is the issue in you know, fully developed form that you've been raising since we started these seminars: centrifugal versus centripetal, right? Are we pulling together into a coherent organism, or are we flying apart into chaos? And for the Greeks, these were the terms cosmos and chaos. If we can act as a whole healthy organism in pursuit of what's good for us, then we're a cosmos. But if we don't act that way, then we're a chaos. And for, you know, the benefit of Elle and James Medler, who are kind of new to this week, kind of the important thing about this cosmos versus chaos idea is that it is not at all the modern idea, which is law and order versus chaos. We think law and order is the opposite of chaos. Chaos is when everybody doesn't follow the law, and all the bad things come from that, and there's irrationality. And we think law and order is the rational, controlled side in which good things happen. The Greeks did not believe that. For them, it's cosmos versus chaos. So for them, many law and order societies in which it's all very orderly and everybody does the same thing are still a chaos. They're a chaos because that orderly society is pointing away from what's healthy. They're all doing it together. They're all marching off the cliff together, but that doesn't make it healthy behavior. To the Greeks, nothing's more important than whether you're engaging in what's healthy for the individual, for the society, for the species, and for the world as a whole. Nothing. You certainly don't put law and order up on a pedestal as a god and say, well, that's the opposite of chaos. To them, Brave New World, the Nazis, Stalinist, repression, all of these things are the same kind of thing. They're all chaos, regardless of whether they're orderly or random. And so this is kind of what Stephen's alluding to here when he talks about centrifugal versus centripetal. Centripetal is the force that points inward when you're in a circle, when you're spinning around, that pulls you in, the thread that binds you so that so that the earth doesn't fly away from the sun. You're pulled in by the centripetal force of gravity. Whereas centrifugal is the tendency to fly apart. And the Greek nuance here would be that you can fly apart in an orderly way and die in an orderly, lawful way just as easily as you can in a chaotic way. That to pull together, it's not just that you pull together, but that the arrow of your organism points in the direction. You've got sophrosune, it points in the direction of health and vitality, and that's the fundamental value that all things need to be evaluated by. So, what Phil's been talking about, what Stephen's been talking about here, the reduction of things in the modern society to just their cash value. What's my return on investment? By putting that first, we're making a similar kind of mistake to what we do when we think that law and order might belong on a pedestal. It's like neither of these things is sophrosune. Neither of these things has to do with the health and vitality of the species. The health and vitality of the species can't be arrived at indirectly. You have to look directly at the problem and say, you can't say, well, sure, it made everybody sick, but at least we followed the law. That's the important thing, that we followed the law. And likewise, you can't say, sure, we made everybody sick, but at least we made a bunch of money, right? Both of those things, you can see how they can be in opposition to health and vitality. And so therefore, they're not adequate substitutes for it. So this is what he doesn't say the word, but the more you work with Kenneth Smith's writing, especially in this book, as you spend time in the ancient worldview, and then it's going to, as we're beginning to spend time in the medieval worldview, you start to see it's not just loaded terms like nature and human nature, right? Because you should be thinking physis, you should be thinking ethos, you should hear, Heraclitus, the nature within and the nature without. He says the human condition, you should see Hannah Arendt's book, The Human Condition, and therefore all the philosophy of Hannah Arendt. It's not just this kind of elusive quality that's on the nose in the text, but it's also you learn to see the words that he didn't write, but that he could have written. Because by the time you're talking about all these things together, you are certainly talking about the ancient Greek worldview, which means you're talking about sophrosune. It's one of the tricks you have to do to really read this philosophy is to know if the topic is this, if we're talking about the perspective of this epoch, then sure, I'll be on the alert for Kenneth's deployment of key terms that were important to that epoch. But also, I will supplement with what I already know to be the loaded key terms of that epoch that mattered to them more than anything. You shouldn't even be able to think about the ancient Greeks or Aristotle or Heraclitus or Plato without the word sophrosune. Just if you have to, put it on a yellow sticky and put it right up there on your computer. It's like, if it's not in the text, it's there anyway, because Kenneth Smith's certainly thinking it, and Plato was certainly thinking it. It's their key question. Are we pointing towards health and vitality, or are we pointing to some other thing that we think is an adequate substitute, but which really, really isn't? It's good stuff. And so Stephen's stuff about centrifugal and centripetal is all about this to the Greeks. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
While I agree with you guys, I think you have mistaken one thing. We do have a religion. Let me put it this way. The Athenians had the Parthenon, the Acropolis and the Parthenon. The Christians have the great churches, the temples of the god, but we have these great skyscrapers, the temple to money. If that's not a religion, I don't know what the hell it is. That is a religion that rallies us into this drive for money and capital. I mean, so we are not devoid of religion. You could say we have the wrong religion, but we are not devoid of religion. Everybody worships. In fact, I have a I have a piece I did when I visited China, and I was just curious. In fact, it's hanging in the wall. Uh, they were selling a lighter with Mao Zedong. It's turned into a lighter because they're turned into a capital structure, and it played the tune "The East is Red." I'm familiar with that, and I thought that was very funny. I bought a bunch of them. I came back, and I have the lighter set in the frame, and above it is the mighty dollar, George Washington. And I said, "The East is green." Not the East is red, the East is green. And that's what happened. Now, I'm not worshiping Mao Zedong, but I just thought it was an irony that their God, Mao Zedong, is now just a common collector's item, turning the East is red into the East is green. If that's not a religion, I don't know what the hell it is. So here it is, the
Yes.
East is green.
Yes. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the color in particular because Donald will say another one of Kenneth's favorite quotes is to quote F. Scott Fitzgerald, says the only thing Americans believe in is the green light. To go, 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 free, 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 do what you want as quickly as possible. Stay busy. This is from The Great Gatsby that he's quoting.
I know you guys not going to have a very decent picture of this, but here it is.
There it is.
The East is green.
Thank
Don't
you.
say the East is red. The East is green.
Yes. Very nice. Well, under modernity, right?
Right.
Although, up until now, the greenback has been the global currency. That may be changing in the next year or two, but I'll leave that as an exercise for the students. All right, so let's go back to this text. So basically what we're saying is that he's kicking off this discussion of religion in paragraph 15 by emphasizing very clearly at the end of paragraph 14 in sentence 11, he's clearly talking about this complicated ancient model for how human culture and human free will and determinism work. This dialectic of dialectics, right? Multiple points of dialectic that allows for feedback loops, that allows things to get better, but it also allows things to get worse, and that emphasizes how important it is that we have a human cultures that will help us to not grow up to be cannibals, that will help us to not grow up to be con men and predators and rapists and murderers and ecocidal and so on. We need the culture to shape us in a good direction, not a bad direction. And where good and bad to the Greeks don't mean the way that God told us to, because as Nietzsche says, no Greek god ever told a Greek thou shalt, but rather that points us to sophrosyne. Can we be a healthy species? Can we be a species that knows what's good for it? And the Greeks said, this is how we can be that species. We can be that species by recognizing that this is our nature and by cultivating religion so that religion will help to cultivate us to take responsibility for these things. The second half of sentence 1, religion in the hands of human insight and conscience, right? Notice the echoing of insight, right? Sentence 11, which we did first, comes at the end of paragraph 14, and he's talking about ultimate insight again. This is that same insight. He doesn't echo terms gratuitously. The man has a big vocabulary. If he's repeating a term, it's because it's a reference, right? He's pointing us at, he's saying this is the same issue that it was before. So this is where he's introducing it. Religion in the hands of human insight and conscience. And given that it's insight and conscience, and at the end it's insight and judgment, it's implying a relationship between conscience and judgment. right? It's also implying a relationship. He talks about the right and the responsibility. If it's a responsibility, then conscience is involved in that, because conscience and responsibility are related. So the first sentence and the last sentence of paragraph 11 are hooking together, sometimes through explicit terms, sometimes through parallelism. He says, religion in the hands of human insight and conscience could foster moral riches and values that nourish the entire organism of the polis. The polis being our city-state, our society by extension, and organism referring to this issue of cosmos versus chaos and sophrosyne. Because if a group of people can act as a cosmos, then they become a larger mega organism, which is what the Greeks thought was healthy. But if they can't do that, if it's every man for himself or factions tearing each other apart, then you can't behave like an organism. And now you're threatened with extinction. It's an existential crisis. The Greeks were terrified of civil war. They just, I'm not talking about one polis versus another, although that wasn't great either. But within the polis, if the tribes turn on each other and the polis tears itself apart, he says, the Greeks thought the history, especially archaic Greek history, had too many examples of self-destruction. And although this haunted them and was their greatest fear, as we know from our discussions about chapter 4, ultimately this is what doomed ancient Greek society and caused it to be replaced with Macedonian society. That the Greeks couldn't stop fighting one polis to another polis. The larger organism of the Greeks, the cosmopolitan, cosmos polis, multiple polites together acting as a cosmos. The Greek could never figure that out. They couldn't get it stable. They could only do it temporarily. And ultimately they tore themselves to pieces. So all of this is being alluded to in this second half of sentence 1. He's saying the stakes are high. The Greeks believe the stakes are as high as they can possibly be. They're existential stakes. These issues of religion, these issues of having religion specifically be the thing that helps us cultivate the insight, the judgment, the conscience that will allow us to cultivate human character, to develop virtuosity, to develop morality and values. He says the result of that is a wealth. It's a nourishment. Like any other nourishment, it's necessary to the diet. It's necessary to the survival of the organism. The organism can't survive unless it eats nourishing food. And in the same way, he's saying here that unless religion is playing this role, at least from the Greek perspective, unless religion is playing this role of cultivating people into the adult form so that they're capable of, of moral insight and judgment, the polis will wither and die. It will sicken and die. It will not have sophrosyne. This is the only way to get it. So that's why I spent this time belaboring the first and last sentences of paragraph 14. Paragraph 15 is all about religion, but paragraph 14 sets it up, both at the beginning and the end of the paragraph, to show what the stakes are and what the ancient perspective is on this issue. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
So famously, Schopenhauer pushed a type of atheism. And he decided, well, Christianity is total bunk. Religion is total bunk. He believed philosophy could replace religion because Schopenhauer famously spent a lot of time on his own. Now, of course, young Nietzsche, along with Wagner, were great fans of Schopenhauer. And of course, there was a point where Nietzsche started to think, oh, there's a problem when you throw the religion out the window. Well, you look at it simply, for the ancients, for the Greek, there's natural facts and there's moral facts. And the god, Jupiter, is a guarantee. I'm not quite sure about the natural facts, but the moral facts go up to this ultimate authority. The Greeks were convinced there were a set of valid moral values which they virtually thought of as facts. Jupiter's up there, man. He's pulling the strings. We do know he's occasional hypocrite, but and it got even worse. We created the all-powerful, absolutely perfect God because the Christians decided we want a perfect God running the universe, one that is not fallible, because after all, I want to go to heaven. Now, if I do all the good things and all the right things and don't enjoy all the fun things like, disorder and pillage, I've denied myself all the fun things in life. I want to be guaranteed of my reward in heaven. Well, an imperfect God's not an absolute guarantee. This is the impression I get with the Christians. We can't have a God that makes the occasional mistake. I don't want to end up in hell when I've been a good person all my life due to a glitch in the system. Nietzsche, of course, famously saw this is a problem, Where are the values going to come along? More importantly, people believe that these values had the guarantee of God. When you've thrown God out the window, you've thrown out the guarantor. Whose values are right? Oh, I'm a man, I'm a philosopher. I'll give you a set of values and I'll say, sorry, you're no better than me. You're just a man. And I can see all your faults because invariably every human will display self-interest, as I do. So this is a problem. Where is there going to be the guarantee for values in the atheist world? Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to this issue of, what is the definition of religion? For example, modern atheists, and Schopenhauer would be included in that, when he's denying religion, he thinks that he's doing something universal, but he doesn't know most religions. He probably knows little about Buddhism or Confucianism or Shintoism. He doesn't know what the possibilities are. He doesn't know about the religion of the, New Guinea tribesmen. He doesn't know about the religion of the Australian Aborigines. He's, like most moderns, defining religion the way that the medieval Europeans defined religion. He's saying, I don't believe in that God or that religion. I have a beef with that religion. And of course, when he says he has a beef with it, what he really means is without realizing he means this, he's saying he has a beef with it in its most corrupted form at the end of the medieval epoch, which is the only thing anybody can remember anymore by Schopenhauer's day. They've completely forgotten the revolutionary, hopeful quality that the medieval religion had back in 500 when it was up against, the corrupt ancient Rome, and was saying that has to end. We have to liberate people from the slavery and this corrupt system. It was a completely different kind of a exercise. It would have been harder in the year 600 for Schopenhauer to be an atheist when medieval religion was everybody's salvation to escape from the corruption of Rome. But when Schopenhauer is writing, it's easy to look back and only see the Christianity in the medieval Europe of 1500, popes engaging in all kinds of scurvy practices that are so corrupt and so rotten that it makes people question whether religion itself should cease to exist. So when Kenneth Smith is quoting the ancients talking about the importance of religion, he's certainly picking up on Nietzsche. Nietzsche post-Schopenhauer, critiquing Schopenhauer, is saying that Schopenhauer has misunderstood the nature of religion. He has assumed that religion is the thing that he didn't like, and he hasn't looked more broadly. And Nietzsche, as a philologist, is reading the ancient Greek far more broadly than most of his predecessors, and he's saying, my goodness, their attitudes about religion were so different than we think they were. They're so different from the medieval attitudes. It's a whole other worldview about what it means to be divine or sacred. And that worldview seems to be life-affirming rather than life-denying. How can you be against being life-affirming? That doesn't make any sense. So he starts to be pro-religion, but only if it's a religion of sophrosyne, not if it's a religion of corruption and empty conventions. And Kierkegaard's going to go through something similar, right? Kierkegaard goes through something similar. He spends almost his entire life developing his Hegelian framework of understanding the human psyche in a way that exalts the importance of religion, right up until the point when he's finally, yes, Kierkegaard for beginners. Thank you, Sharon. Right up until the point when he realizes that the churches around him in Copenhagen are just, they're just empty forms, that they betray everything Jesus stood for. They're just conventional. They're just ways for people to get forgiveness for doing terrible things in their economic dealings. And he says that's the worst part of medieval religion is the indulgences. How can you embrace that part and leave out all the stuff Jesus said about having solidarity with poor people, solidarity with prostitutes, solidarity with strangers, treating people like your brothers and sisters? That's supposed to be the heart of it. And so, the final stuff Kierkegaard writes is this withering denunciation of modern forms of religion. And in doing so, it's just the flip side of what Nietzsche's doing later on when he goes after Schopenhauer for throwing out religion. So, it's hard for modern atheists to think about religion outside of the medieval, especially the late medieval corrupt framework, or God help us, the modern framework of televangelists every Sunday morning telling you to give you their bank accounts, give them your bank accounts. That anybody should be against that. Of course, people should be against that, but that doesn't mean that that's religion. That's commerce, right? This is Kenneth Smith's argument about modernity. Modernity is a system in which nature's not sacred. The medievals overthrew that. But God's also not sacred. The moderns overthrew that. And so only human beings are sacred. But since, as the ancients point out, human beings are a big problem in this department. I mean, you get everything from, psychopaths and genocidal mass killers on the one hand to, Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi and Grandma Moses on the other, and that range is too big to generalize about. You can't say people are sacred when some people are murdering and eating each other, but you also can't say people suck when you've got people like Martin Luther King out there. It's like you can't generalize about this topic. You need a frame of reference, and the sacred supplied a frame of reference that medievals could use to interpret Homo sapiens. Nature, physis, supplied a frame of reference that ancients could use to evaluate Homo sapiens. But by overthrowing both of those, moderns have left themselves with nothing. And so we settle for, how many votes do you have and how much money do you have? And that's the end of it, right? You comply with the law or don't comply with the law. Well, if you don't want to comply with the law, do you have enough money to buy enough legislators to change the law and make it what you want it to be? Or buy enough judges so that you can break the law and you'll never be convicted of it. I mean, the whole thing becomes this empty artifice in which nothing really matters because we've removed our frames of reference. And this is the problem that happens, following up on what Stephen's saying, when you remove religion from the picture, or when you define religion as something other than what Kenneth Smith is talking about here. It says the roots of religion, right, are designed to address this fundamental, inescapable problem of human nature and human condition. And if you throw religion out, what are you going to supply to address those problems in human nature and human condition? It better not just be denial. You can't just say, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That these rights are inalienable, and we've defined ourselves as not screwing up. We've defined ourselves as never eating each other. Just pay no attention to Ted Bundy knocking in college co-eds' heads. We'll just pretend that that's not happening. Let's just pretend. It's the other thing about growing up in alcoholic families. I watched a lot of pretending. Let's not talk about dad in the bottle. Let's not mention it. Just if we don't talk about it, everything's fine, right? So I have a low tolerance for denial. So I'm really open to what Kenneth is saying here. What he's saying the Greeks would say about us, which is we have removed the major two pillars that the past epochs of European history used to try to address the most important problem in our lives. We knocked those pillars down and said, those aren't real, they don't matter. And then we never replaced them with anything. So yeah, corrupt medieval religion is terrible, and corrupt imperial ancient culture is terrible. But what about the non-corrupt forms? What about the healthy forms? They were doing work for us. And now that we've chucked those things out, nothing's doing that work for us, which means all the very worst excesses of all the weaknesses, all the dangers of the human condition are now, what did we say? Free, right? Isn't freedom the greatest good? They're free. We're free to commit genocide. We're free to commit ecocide. We're free to treat each other like utensils. We're free to do anything because nothing really matters in a system that doesn't have a frame of reference. So that's the setup. So let's go into paragraph 15. We're an hour and a half in. We have done our prep work. We have finished paragraph 14. And paragraph 15 is where we start talking directly about religion. And when you look at this sentence, you can see immediately the references back. This is the first sentence of paragraph 15. You can see immediately the references back to the first sentence of paragraph 14. This is, I mean, we're at the end now of chapter 5, right? We're at the end of the introduction of the medieval period. We know religion per se, as such, is going to be the critically important topic for the next 1,000 years of European history. So he's turning to face it in paragraphs 14 and 15. He's putting some argument and discussion together to set up a framework for evaluating this. So he starts by saying, for the contrast, ancient religion existed to further the culture of the polis, the culture of the right. And what do we see in sentence 1? We talked about the nourishing the entire organism of the polis, right? Again, the parallelism. So it's the culture. Ancient religion develops the culture to foster the moral riches and values to nourish the entire organism of the polis. You can draw these comparisons and make these linkages, and you're seeing the whole picture. But Kenneth is trying to, like somebody trying to project a spherical globe onto a flat map. Kenneth is trying to project a complicated, multidimensional set of value relationships onto a linear sequence of words. And just like the Mercator projection, it's going to end up distorted. So he's trying to give us the training wheels or the trail of breadcrumbs that we need to reconstruct, in our reading, to not stop with the words in the text, but to reconstruct that multidimensional system of values and issues that he was thinking of when he wrote this thing. So, he expects you to make these connections and notice these parallels. Polis. Where first sentence 14, first sentence of 15, where, this is on purpose. This kind of parallelism, this rhythm, this rhyme, Martin Luther King Jr. used to use it in his speeches all the time. So one of the things I love about him as a speaker is not just the subject, which is great, but the way that he would use the rhythm of the language to help you to figure out what is the meaning underneath the words. And Kenneth doesn't write anything like MLK, but he's using similar poetic devices. So to further the culture of the polis, to serve as its foundation of piety, right? The polis, he's saying, is built atop a culture. If you don't have a culture of sophrosune, you can't build a polis. You could certainly collect a bunch of random people together and let them tear at each other. The Greeks would say that's what our modern cities or towns or rural areas are. That's where we just chuck a bunch of people together and let them sabotage each other. But to be an actual legitimate polis, you have to hold certain things sacred. And the things that you hold sacred have to include the importance of working together as a cosmos and not tearing each other apart in chaos. And that includes not allowing dystopian law and order systems to arise because they too are a chaos, because they don't point towards sophrosune. They unite us towards a cliff instead of towards sophrosune. That's also chaos. This is the foundation, saying if you don't get this part right, it doesn't matter what you build on top of it. So you're putting your castle in the sand. Or I guess it was one of the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, right? Which is the speech between the father and the son. Says, everybody said I couldn't build a castle in the swamp, but I proved them wrong. I built a castle, and then it sank. So then, atop its ruins, I built another castle, and it fell down. But then I built a third castle, and it caught on fire and sank and fell down. But this fourth castle, this is finally there because there's enough rubble underneath to serve as a foundation so we don't sink in the mire. It's one of the funnier moments of the Holy Grail. Sorry, Holy Grail. So, but what he's saying the same thing effectively here, saying you try to build a culture, you try to build a polis or any kind of society without that sacred foundation. Nothing else you do, you can pass all the laws you want. Nothing else you do matters. You're going to fail. You're going to fail. You don't have to have groupthink. You don't have to have everybody thinking exactly the same thing. You can have an enormous, as we've talked about before, you can have, and in fact, you need enormous diversity of perspectives, including differences in value systems. But those differences need to be around a shared core. And that shared core needs to point you at sophrosune and solidarity. So if you don't have solidarity and you aren't focusing on sophrosune, then you don't have the foundation. Everything's going to fail. And this is why the Greeks say this is fundamentally a sacred issue, because everything depends on it. It's more important than any number of petty squabbles that tear a society apart. The ancients believed, and even the medievals believed this, that there needs to be a separation of a sort between the sacred and the mundane. And in the realm of the mundane, you can have all kinds of freedom. You can have all kinds of experimentation, no problem. And that includes the ability to question things. You know, should we actually build this dam and create an aquifer here? What are the pros and cons? Should we drill for oil in this location? What are the pros and cons? These are all things that can be debated. Should I pick vanilla or chocolate? Whatever. These are mundane issues. But the issues under debate shouldn't include things like, should I kill and eat you? Are some of us less human than others? Should we commit ecocide and destroy the capacity to live here? These things should be beyond question. Because if they're not, you don't have the foundation. You're destroying your relationship with nature, you're destroying your relationship with each other, then you have no foundation and everything you do is going to fall apart. So it's a sacred thing. And by sacred, we mean it's not that nobody can ever question it, but the process of questioning has to be very, very different. You don't just hold a vote and see what people want to do. So you are unlucky enough to have a bunch of people who think, yeah, let's eat each other. Then, you never should have put that to a vote. This is not a mundane issue. It's the kind of issue you work on generationally, talking to people and teaching people. And hopefully at some point they grow up. It's a sacred issue, not to be confused with a mundane issue. So all of this he's alluding to through the previous paragraph and through its allusions here. And that's why he concludes this first sentence of paragraph 15 by saying, religion is a human natural need and value, indispensable to balanced perspective and sanity. He's not saying corrupt medieval religion is. He's not saying televangelists are. He's not saying supernaturalism is. He's saying none of those things. But a cultural form that plays this role of protecting, recognizing and protecting and teaching the sacred to ensure that we don't wreck ourselves before we even get out of the gate. He's saying that is indispensable. So if history teaches us anything, it's the futility of trying to make a society when you haven't settled these basic issues. And I'm just going to refer back to what Stephen said when he said how shocked he was to see that what was supposed to be the world's advanced superpower, landing men on the moon and taking us to the stars, instead had devolved to the point where they were armed camps who were hostile to each other and prepared to be violent towards each other, teetering on the edge of a civil war. Says, when you are that much of a chaos, everything else you try to do is futile. You have to settle that issue first. It's a sacred issue. The mundane issues can't exist without the sacred foundation under it to keep us from wrecking ourselves and wrecking our relationship with the world. So all this is at stake in this first sentence of paragraph 15. And it's easier to think about now that we've done the dissection last week and this week of the first and last sentences of paragraph 14. We've looked at these issues and how this is tied to the Greek interpretation of what does it mean to be human? What is it that makes us the species that we are? And they say, well, it's not that we have a hand, and it's not that we think, and it's not that we use tools, it's not that we use language, not any of these things moderns are obsessed with. It's how dependent we are on culture to teach us sophrosune, because we're missing sophrosune. The cult is wobbly on its legs, but it's born with sophrosune. And that sophrosune will ensure that no matter how weak and wobbly it is when it begins, it will generally do the right thing to grow up to be a healthy horse. It's got the instincts, it's got the interests, It's got the awareness. It has the drives. It wants to do those things that make it better at being a horse. But we don't. And what nature has given us as a substitute is creativity, culture, and enthusiasm, which can lead us to great things and it can lead us to terrible things because there's no compass there to point us towards the great things. This is the role, this is why religion plays this role in this discussion, because of this gap in Homo sapiens. Questions, comments, or concerns before I go on in paragraph 15? Does this all make sense? All right. Well then, how about our next? Oh yeah, Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, well, a few days ago, I went to a Buddhist monastery. Apparently, they have them in Australia now. Anyway, you know, there's a point where they do all their rigmarole and they have a little meal, and then they have a Buddhist monk, you know, sort of preaching whatever is their philosophy. And it was all right until I asked one question. I said, how do we know what we are doing is really piety? It could be vanity. Or for example, if I look at, you know, a Grand's mountain, you know, it's a windless day and you see all the pine trees going up the mountain and you feel an absolute sense of awe. You know, it's, I think Goethe talked about it, where you feel the ancient gods of your fathers, virtually. It feels fantastic, but is that piety? Or is that really a type of vanity? How many things which I think are pious could actually be vanity? And this is a question that comes up in, for example, Ecclesiastes, you know, in the axial age where suddenly, oh, you know, I was doing all the right things, you know, I was going to the temple and praying and I'm a good man. I'm a good man. That one's very big at the moment. I'm a good person. It's the other guy that's bad. But, you know, Ecclesiastes is saying, well, beware of vanity. Something that wasn't an issue was, say, so much at the time of Moses. But in this new world, this axial age world, so the one that is the good life a type of vanity? You go to the pre-axial age and it was quite clear. The good life is the good life. You know, contrasted with the bad life. There's a sin away the Egyptian. There's a good life and there's a bad life. But then, you know, a skepticism comes with the era of the Greek philosophers, like, is my good life really a good life or is it vanity? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. These are tough issues, you know, and one of the things Kenneth Smith talks about is how noesis, Verstand, is not able to create larger wholes. That's the function of gnosis, of begriff. But noesis is able to cut wholes down into smaller parts. It has this great analytical power, this great skeptical power. And it can devolve into a cynical power to the point where you question everything. And it's a problem for us because noesis is our main, according to the Greeks, it's our main correction against the problems of gnosis, the parochialism, the tendency to overestimate the importance of our own perspective. But it doesn't do that by helping us to form healthier wholes. That's a gnosis function. It does it by teaching us how to criticize things that are rotten. And we can develop our powers of criticism to such an extent that we gain the ability to criticize the sacred things as well as the mundane things. That is, to treat sacred issues as though they aren't sacred at all. They're just mundane issues that for some reason people are reluctant let me criticize, and then to get a charge out of cutting them down to size. I mean, I've been that guy. I remember my adolescent intellectual phase, cutting, and what Kenneth says is the danger here, and he says he gets this out of Kierkegaard and Hegel and elsewhere. The danger in doing this is that one feels confident because one is able to find the weaknesses in the things that one is criticizing. But what one isn't able to notice in the process of doing that is when one has gone from criticizing something optional to criticizing something necessary. That's how people talk themselves into suicide and mass murder and things like that. They start to think there's no difference between the sacred things that are holding us all together and the mundane things that should be, there for freedom of thought. And so people start thinking, well, I've got all this fracking waste I developed in the process of, generating this profit, and it would cost me money to dispose of it properly. So I need to find some cheap way to get rid of it. I know I'll dump it in an aquifer, right? Who cares? Fresh water, who cares about that? That's not important. And it won't leak before I'm dead. The aquifer is deep underground. So the poisoning will happen 1,000 years from now. I can't be held accountable for that. So why shouldn't I poison all the aquifers of North America and then have 10,000, 100,000 years of poison being released into the soil? Why not? Right? That's not what's important. What's important is, can I make my quarterly return on investment? And if I can drive down my cost of disposing of this toxic waste by doing that, then I win. That's a good thing. So this makes perfect sense if you're driven by a spreadsheet. I'm not trying to mock it. I'm trying to illustrate the danger of analytical thinking, because analytical thinking isn't able to recognize what's sacred. To the Benalso, says Kenneth Smith, all those issues that Aristotle are concerned about don't exist. It's like they're tilting at windmills. They're hallucinating or something. It's gibberish. The Benalso, I believe that Aristotle are half effective Benalso. You're saying you have some good ideas and you get some good things going, but then right when you're about to do something really profitable, for no apparent reason, you veer off and waste everybody's time talking about things that don't exist, that aren't important. Because to the analytical mind, those things are no different than all the other things that the analytical mind cuts down to size on a regular basis. So, Kenneth talks about the transition from mythos culture to logos culture in ancient Greece. He says, the turning point, the rise of sophistry happens when people have developed these powerful intellectual analytical tools, but not the wisdom to know what they shouldn't apply those tools to. And they begin tearing apart the foundations of the value system of ancient Greek society. And when they do that, everything starts to fall apart into civil wars. It's like within a few decades, it's over for ancient Greece. One of the points Kenneth makes is logic, systematic thinking works great as long as you have the right premises. But where the right premises come from is not a logical analytical function. It's a gnosis function. It's a sacred function. It has to do with taste and judgment and the evaluation of the greater whole, which can only come with a great deal of experience and insight and judgment. You can't logic your way to the correct premises. And if you don't have the right premises, all your logic doesn't help you because you're starting from the wrong premises. With the wrong premises, you can reach any conclusion, even horrible, life-killing conclusions you can reach, and you'll convince yourself it's legit because the logic worked. So he says, this is, and I can't remember who he's quoting. Maybe Donald will remember. Kenneth is quoting somebody or paraphrasing somebody when he says, this is the Achilles heel of logic. It feels so systematic and powerful and righteous, but the blind spot that it has is only the blind spot about the very most important things there are. Everything else it's fine with. But when it comes to the life and death sacred stuff, logic is completely blind. It doesn't know where to start and it doesn't know where to stop. And thus it is that logos cultures have a tendency to wreck themselves. They pull on all the threads, including the threads that are holding us all together. They look the same to them. The thread's a thread. James, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Since we're talking about the sacred and you mentioned stallions, I'm also thinking about Mustangs. And I know this might be off topic, but since we're talking about the sacred, I'm thinking, I was told an atheist of a popular call-in YouTube show I said to him, I said, if there is no God, is there anything that is sacred, and can anything be sacred? And he said, no, there is no such thing as sacred if there is no God. There's your answer. And as a philosopher and a scientist and a skeptic, even though I have some belief in me, um, I still don't think that's true. And well, with that being said, um, if we don't keep searching and asking the question, does God exist, and where does he fit into our modern culture, and all the questions that we're talking about this afternoon, um, doesn't that mean that we're letting him be untamed? Shouldn't our great struggle of humanity be to be the untamed, to be always to be trying to tame the untamable? And God is kind of the thought of God is kind of this untamable thought that not many have been able to tame.
Yes. That what you're describing as that atheist perspective, that's who I was in my teens and early 20s when I thought that I didn't realize the extent to which my concept of religion was very narrow. That I thought I was against religion because I thought I knew what religion was, but my definition of religion was so narrow, it didn't include a lot of religions. It wouldn't include Buddhism or Confucianism or Shintoism. It wouldn't include Taoism. It wouldn't include all kinds of things. It certainly wouldn't include ancient Greek religion. So I thought I'd done a huge thing by rejecting the corrupt medieval form of God without understanding that that is only one of many possible ways of defining the sacred. And so it took me a while. It took me basically, I had to experience different kinds of religions in which there might not be any gods at all, and yet it was still a religion. There might not even be any supernatural at all, and yet it was still a religion. And what made it a religion was that it was trying to identify what are the sacred things without which human life is impossible or undesirable. What are the things that are the foundation for everything else, the things that we should protect more than other things, or nurture and grow more than other things. And so since then, my take on these things has shifted a great deal. But I'm able to look back at perspectives like the one you're describing, that atheist holding, and I know where he's coming from, but I also see the blind spot. And it's not a idiosyncratic blind spot. It is our legacy that we inherited from the revolutionaries, the early modern revolutionaries who were overthrowing and pushing off against the deeply corrupt late stage medieval power systems, right? Which we had to get out of. Just like the early medievals had to break free from the late Roman corrupt empire, so the early moderns had to break free from the late medieval corrupt systems that were there then. And so when you're founded by that kind of a pushing off process, what Hegel calls a negation, it always inevitably causes the culture and the mindsets that follow to over polarize and say the old way is bad and the new way is good. Everything the old way thought was important is bad. And we will embrace all the things that they didn't like. And we will reject all the things that they liked. It is the most it's like a child who's fed up with his parents and says, I'm going to be the opposite of them. And it's not until he grows older and wiser that he comes to understand, my parents did some bad things, but they did some good things too. And if I throw everything out, I'm going to lose all that good stuff. I can't dramatize and polarize and melodramatize and just say everything that they stood for is bad. I need to develop the nuance and the insight and the judgment, to use the terms that he's using here in this, right? In order to separate the wheat from the chaff and have a more well-rounded appreciation of the role of growing up. It's not just about saying no, I'm against that stuff. It's also about saying yes. What is the stuff that was there that was important? It's like if we always, and it's the temptation, if we always throw out the baby with the bathwater, we're always resetting and starting over. What we want to do is preserve the good and then address the bad, right? We don't want to say that the only way we can get rid of the bad is to chuck out the good along with it. So that's why gradually I've come around to this more nuanced position than the atheist you're describing held, which is that, you know, whether something is sacred or not has nothing to do with whether it conforms to the medieval religion, especially the late corrupt medieval religion. It has to do with other things, and that doesn't have to be literally true. I don't have to be literally correct, but I can recognize that other epochs and worldviews held that position. That the ancients, for example, have a radically different concept of religion than the medievals do, a radically different concept of religion than the one that modern atheists reject. Right? It would be very hard for a modern atheist to reject the ancient Greek religion because it was so different. It's founded on such different principles. It's only by looking back at the ancient Greek religion as though it is medievalism that we're able to scoff at it, and the way that we do. So if we actually dig into it, and all this stuff we've talked about today, about the structure of the human psyche, about free will and determinism, about the need to take responsibility for cultivating your own character, about the need to integrate yourself into a larger society and framework and ecology, and that being a duty, as well as expressing yourself and individuating, all this rich stuff about the human condition. It's the heart of the ancient Greek religion, which is not at all what I learned from reading Bulfinch's mythology or Hamilton's mythology, right? Which assumed the modern perspective that this old religion must have been an Abrahamic religion, which it's not. So I'm glad you brought that up, James. I mean, it's really interesting. These are interesting things to wrestle with. You know, can something matter in the absence of the medieval religious framework? And, you know, God, I hope so, because they've mattered to all kinds of people in all kinds of epochs who didn't hold the medieval religious framework. It's kind of our hope for the future, if anything's going to matter for us too. Hey, Phil, what's on your mind?
What's in my mind is that not only has reason and logic uh, isolated us in a way, but there's actually a sort of a phenomenological or sort of feeling perspective that's important in terms of I'll not call it religion, this sort of spiritual awakening. It almost seems like there we need to have respect for something that is transcendent, that is beyond us. There's a mystery involved. And I'll first start with a painter, what's his name now? Caspar David Friedrich. Always people looking into nature, but they are just like staring like, well, there's something beyond, something further than our understanding, a mystery that in a sense we have to reach for. And so it has something to do with the fact that it makes us question and whatever it is. Then I go to Beethoven when Beethoven says, you know, music is the gateway to the deeper the path to the deeper understanding that understands us, but we do not understand it. Okay, so there's also something about that, and then I'll stop with a painter, not Caspar David, but Albert Bierstadt, who in the 19th century painted these magnificent paintings of the Rocky Mountains. You just feel the awe of his paintings. And now in the 21st century, 20th century, 21st century, like the Rocky Mountain is just a backyard. I mean, it's no longer a mystery. We fly over with planes, you know, we drive over whatever. It's just like, you know, and we have photographs of it. We don't even have to look at the Rocky Mountains. We just have photographs of it. And so it's no longer a mystery. It's just the thing next door. I mean, like the fact that we do not have the distance, then that the mystery is gone. It's like we no longer look at the Rocky Mountains like Albert Bierstadt saw it. I mean, so therefore, in a sense, the familiarity of it has demystified it. So are we losing the mystery because we have become familiar. I mean, we have to now fly a satellite beyond the heliopause to find the new mysteries. I mean, like, but we can't be there to witness it. We have to depend on our technology. I mean, so I wonder whether this almost faces the contradiction that perhaps too much knowledge and too much information that's a killer of the mysteries. And we have figured everything out, you know? So I wonder whether, because I often said I don't need to go to Mount Machu Picchu to feel the awe of civilization. I like to look at, you know, my backyard or whatever it is and find a small part that I still find mysterious and interesting, you know? So I think we have to learn how to look at something familiar and see the unfamiliar within it so that there is a revealing process, you know, like in some way it's kind of like a haiku, you know, you capture small part and there's still a mystery how it could reflect the world in such a beautiful way and just, you know, three simple lines with only very few words, you know. It's like, so I think if we do that, and instead of looking at the grand scale, we could see the small scale how it reflects the mystery of the cosmos in a way. And so that's training ourselves to see in a different way, rather than say,
Yes.
"Oh, I've been there, done that. I've been over the Rocky Mountains, no big deal." You know, like
Yes.
I go camping there. It's like, you know, it's just like the backyard. So I wonder whether we have put ourselves in that position that we no longer have any reverence for anything because it's all capturable. That's it, Phil. Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for mentioning Caspar David Friedrich and Albert Bierstadt. They're two of my favorite painters. Uh, Anyone who has not yet had the pleasure of spending time looking at paintings by Friedrich or Bierstadt, I put the links in the chat, and you can you can follow up on them at your leisure. But Friedrich had this capacity to depict, and Phil's right. It was frequently somebody standing in a wide wilderness in the foreground, and the wilderness is in the background, and they're looking away from us. We can't see their face, and they're looking out into this majesty, just sort of standing there awestruck. And Friedrich had a way of using the light to really convey the sense of the sharpness of what's close, but also the beautiful haze of what's in the distance. You know, kind of there was a glow to his paintings. It was magnificent, and is very much reminiscent of what happens if you actually go up into the mountains, especially if you go into mountain ranges where they make their own weather. You know, the weather is constantly changing, which means the light is constantly changing, and so from 1 second to the next, 1 minute to the next, you sit down to eat lunch, and you sit down and it's a bright sunny day, and by the time you're done, there's clouds moving across, not blocking out the sun, but passing across. So you've got shadows and light moving up and over all the ridges that you thought you understood and bringing them into a new detail that wasn't apparent just seconds before. There's a scene in Hayao Miyazaki's film Princess Mononoke. It's fairly early in the film after the initial crisis, and our protagonist is riding his red elk from his people's land in the far distant wilderness towards civilization, which is the source of the problems that he's been sent to address. And there are these quiet montages with the music playing where he's just walking across these mountain meadows, and the clouds are moving in the sky, and shafts of light are crossing the ground as he's walking there, and the whole space is doing that thing that you see in a Caspar David Friedrich painting, or that
Well,
you
you
see
know,
if you spend time in
I
nature.
thank you for you mentioning about walking through the mountains. I had that experience, and actually I wrote about it, uh, driving through the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is a beautiful, beautiful drive, you know. It's maybe not the most magnificent, but it's certainly the way the movement across the mountains, and sometimes in the ridge way, and sometimes one side the other, and the what seemed like fog, but it's actually low-lying clouds. It's
Hmm.
like it's just a wonderful rhythm, not only the beauty of the nature, but the rhythm that you go through it. It's almost like music in a way.
Yes.
So anybody who has not driven the Blue Ridge Parkway, uh, I would advise you to do it. It's a beautiful experience, and it
Yes.
really transformed you. And toward the end, it was very interesting because what I saw was there was it was close to some freeway, not freeway, but highway. And I was just surprised because all the drive through the Blue Ridge Parkway, I encountered maybe two or three cars. And when I just come close to this uh, sort of highway, there were many, many more cars. And I said, like, what are these people? I mean, like, they're all rushing to work, trying to make money to live. I understand that. But nonetheless, they have forgotten the beauty of nature itself. It's like the count, the count between the number of cars in the Blue Ridge Parkway, which is less efficient, no question about it. And the one is in the highway. It's not even a freeway, just a highway. Is like it must be like the hundreds to one in
Hmm.
some sense. So therefore, I was thinking, my gosh, I can't forget that relationship between efficiency and inefficiency, and how we sacrifice our beauty of an experience,
Yes.
awe of nature, versus the necessity of chasing after money. It's like it really struck me. That's it, Phil.
Well, and that underscores what I was going to say in response to your first comments, which is that whether or not more information deadens us to the sacred depends on the kind of information we're getting. I'm going to quote Hegel's bit about, to abstract is to be in error. When we're collecting abstract information, it might tickle us at first or interest us or excite us. But the more we do it, the less it moves us. And it reminds me of the difference between a popcorn flick and a great film. A popcorn flick you might or might not enjoy the first time, but every time thereafter you go back and watch it again, you enjoy it less because there isn't anything else there. It's only the surface, and once you've mastered the surface, it's just repetition. Whereas a great film, you go back to it the second time and you see all kinds of things you couldn't see the first time because it's working on your presuppositions. And the first time you went through, you assumed certain things. And so you were really surprised by it and captured by it. You go back the second time, and now you see all this stuff that was always there, but that you weren't prepared to see. You didn't have the perspective to see. And so it's like you're enjoying the film for the first time, the second time, but in a way you never could have the first time. And great works are like that. You can go back to them over and over, Shakespeare, or right now it's Saint-Saëns. I'm listening to piano concertos by Saint-Saëns. And I go back to them and I hear new things every time I go back, things that make the work greater and that were always there, but I wasn't prepared to understand them the first time I encountered them. And part of what's happening there is the difference between sort of empty noesis and kind of rich infinite gnosis. It's a little pencil drawing of a mountain is all well and good, but you actually go to the mountain and it's bigger than you are and it's constantly changing. And it's an endless fountain of new experiences and insights.
Well, your last statement reminded me of I thought about Narcissus, about reflection. Of course, Narcissus looked at the reflection. It was his beautiful capture. He looked at it, but he was not looking at the other the other meaning of reflection, which is deep thinking, because he couldn't peer beyond the surface of the water, and so he had a very shallow uh, understanding of reflection versus a much more nuanced, deeper penetration beneath the water, and in some sense, in a deeper way of thinking, doing things. So reflection is kind of important. depending how you look at reflection. And without that, he could only look at the thing that it is now.
Yes.
He could not come unto himself.
Yes.
That'll become
Yes.
more and come unto himself. Only through that deeper reflection could you come into being, in the future, into yourself.
Thank you, Phil. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. Good to see you
Hey,
again.
yeah, I have a couple of things I want to have I'll save it or I'll try to give pieces of it another time of the long soliloquy going on in my mind about what you guys are talking about with experiencing beauty and the popcorn film versus the great film, which is essentially, I think, of the relationship between objects and relationships between living things. This is when you have an object, you have the law of diminishing returns, very quickly diminishes our pleasure. And I deeply study the biology of this, the neuroscience of it, and I'd really love to talk about this more at some point, versus the experience with living things, where the more time you spend with it, the more rich it is. And essentially, this is to give a quick introduction. It's the relationship between dopamine and serotonin, which are the two pleasure molecules of experience that we have, and the underlying almost philosophy or modeling in our biology that reflects. And it's fascinating that I hear, maybe I'm being too reductive, but I hear the conversation with Kenneth and philosophy and who was it? Who is it? Hegel that you said is to abstract is to err. This
That's
is
Hegel.
essentially to just chase after dopamine and to not go with serotonin. This is also a relationship with Ecclesiastes or Kohelet in Hebrew, which means a congregation, or a kahal or kahila means a community. So it's this. There's a secret in there, which is whether you're community driven or self driven, where I'm an I or a we. But no, I really wanted to say about James, his idea of atheism and religion being no God means no sacred, which I disagree, at least, assuming that in this case, what's sacred is something that's axiomatic, that you just assume to be true, that's beyond oneself. In this case, I'm going to use the argument of truth. Now, a lot of nihilists and atheists will deny truth, but in that denial, they're actually smuggling a bunch of baggage of self-contradictory truth, which is to say something axiomatically doesn't exist is a form of just saying I mythologically believe in that statement, which is a truth. You can't go beyond that. And so to say that there is nothing sacred is almost a form of something sacred. It's, in this case, you're saying a truth, which is nothing is sacred, or in this case, nothing has meaning, or everything is changing and nothing has an essential form. Well, that in of itself is an essential form that you're using, which is actually a beautiful paradox, ironically. And so it smuggles in a bunch of baggage to say that nothing is sacred is a form of saying something sacred, because you're just assuming that. You're saying you can't go beyond that, and you're going to use some logical proof, some rationality to get you through it. But essentially, you're starting at this principle, which essentially, I just hear truth. You're saying this is a truth. This is an always unchanging statement that nothing is sacred. And to me, that's so ironic, because it smuggles in the baggage that that statement itself is a sacred statement. And it's a self-denying, self-effacing sort of perspective. And this is where I don't want to criticize atheism. I don't want to be self-righteous in the sense that what I know is absolutely true. I'd like to believe I could be wrong, and atheism could be right. There could be no meaning to life. There could be no God. There could be no creator. I don't have access to that. That's where I want to be humble. I don't have access to that. Maybe that's true. Maybe I believe in something else based on my own assumptions. Totally fine. But in that assumption that there is no God and there is nothing sacred, suggests something else that essentially, like a lot of people, and I'm pretty sure we're mostly going to agree here, so I don't want to just preach to the choir, but that in of itself is a strange form of a religion that is denying any existence of religion. It's like, I'm a religious person that denies religion. It's like, I'm a human that's denying my own humanity. We're like, well, in order to deny your humanity, you have to be human to do that, which is kind of a weird, never-ending problem. So I find the problem with atheism is not that it's beliefs, but its lack of really investigating its own internal structure as, well, there's a belief in there that says that there's no beliefs. right? That in of itself is a type of belief. And it's to say that atheism is like that there is no God and there is no religion is kind of a type of religion of itself. It has its own worship, its own mythology in there. And it's more like reminds me of a certain type of um, mental unhealth or delusional state when people have certain types of strokes, where they get into these delusional being. Usually, the classic one is paranoid schizophrenia, but in general, there's many of these where they have this delusional sense of self, which, to be honest, life and our experience of everything is a form of delusion. But it's whether it's a very much a denial based sense of existence rather than an affirming based. It's almost to go with Nietzsche. There's no life affirming. Very much I'm going to deny things, and that is my form of embracing. I only embrace this denial aspect, and it's a very strange disconnect from reality as opposed to trying to get closer to reality. And I don't want to talk too long, but I find this very interesting, and almost from like an anthropological point of view, like studying someone else's systems, getting out of my own values, but the strange value of having no values, almost that it's a strangeness that's a weirdness that you're denying reality is your reality, or denying meaning is your meaning. It's a complete nullification of everything, which I can't get past that in terms of my own thinking about it. But I find it very strange. It's like a strange loop that's a strange paradox that you can see clearly from the outside, but inside you're just stuck. It's almost like that labyrinth or something that you're stuck on the inside. And you can get stuck in it easily. And the only thing to validate that from again not being righteous is I'm certain. Again, this is my own mythos here. I am certain all of us have our own forms of this, and this is kind of what Kenneth is doing in the trying to critique modernity. We're stuck in our own form of delusion inside it. We just can't see to some degree what we're deluded by. But I love that we're trying to explore our delusions, but ultimately we have our limitations, right? So I don't want to judge the atheist in the sense that they're stuck in delusion, because I'm stuck in my own delusion too. But I'd like to at least say I'm a little further along because I recognize that I'm stuck in delusion, and I'm trying to go beyond that by, to some degree, validating the delusions themselves.
Yes. Fantastic, Ari. That's where it comes down, is the distinction between the philosophical and the merely rhetorical, is that the philosophical understands that the purpose of these tools that we're developing, these ways of thinking, these perspectives, is to try to liberate ourselves from the traps our brains are in. And it starts with recognizing that our brains are in traps. And the person who is most trapped is the person who thinks that they're not in a trap, who thinks that they see the world the way it actually is. Because from the ancient perspective, no human being can see the world the way it actually is. It's exactly like saying which flat map is a perfect, precise representation of the spherical globe. And the answer is geometry doesn't work that way. You'll never get a perfect representation of a spherical globe on a flat plane. It can't happen. It's not possible. They're different. They're fundamentally, qualitatively different. And so trying to fit the infinite cosmos into the finite mind is the same kind of qualitative mismatch. There's not room for the cosmos in the human brain. So we start by recognizing that all of us are mired in ideologies. And with that recognition, then the challenge then becomes, to identify what are my ideologies and what practice and work do I have to do to try to get out of them? And, understanding that there's an endless ferment. The other thing that I'd kind of add in what you said that I think is useful is, I think one of the reasons why people, and by the way, I love the serotonin dopamine discussion. That was great. I'm not going to comment on it just because I think it's great and it stands well on its own. I don't really have anything to add. But the this issue of being stuck in a loop around rejecting something, Hegel talks about this. He says this is the way the dialectic works. It works by negating the previous. You move to the next stage through a process of negating the previous stage. And if you don't negate the previous stage, you're not going to move to the next stage. We develop noesis because of our dissatisfaction with gnosis. And that causes us, of course, to overreact and throw out the baby with the bathwater, which is why those people who try to develop the step beyond that, try to develop out of Verstand and into Vernunft, they have to negate the negation. They have to say, this new stage that I moved into that I thought was going to solve all my problems, well, it solved some of my problems, but it also created new problems I didn't used to have before. So it itself is also a problem. So I have to negate it too. And that's where Hegel says you end up going back to the baby you threw out with the bathwater and saying, I don't want the bathwater, but I think I need to take this baby back. And meanwhile, the new thing I've adopted, I like that baby, but I think I need to chuck the bathwater that I took on when I took on that second baby. And maybe with the two babies, I got something to work with here. So there is this process. And he says, we go through this process over and over. So, but you can see how if you were, one of the early Christians, or the Jews under the late Roman Empire, and you're they're oppressing the shit out of you, and their justifications are totally empty. I mean, they have these glorious words that they've gotten very good at saying, and they put them on their coins, and they pronounce them all the time, and it's like, well, that slogan sounds great, but when I look at what you actually do, it doesn't match at all. You're just lining your pockets while claiming to be, about peace on earth and brotherhood towards men, both of which are sayings that showed up on Roman coins, by the way, during certain dynasties. So you can see how for a Jew or a Christian under the corrupt Roman Empire, negation could be your top priority. You might not have a lot of energy left to focus on other things because the corruption is in your face every minute of every day, and it won't leave you alone. It's just relentlessly tormenting you, making your life and your friends' lives and your family's lives worse in every way. And you're like, until that's dealt with, you don't have any space to breathe to try to move towards something positive. You got to shake off this negative thing. And this is how early moderns felt growing up, under the late medieval epoch. It's like, I want to be able to.
Can I jump in real fast?
Yeah,
and say how that really relates to, I think I can intuit, but I can't explicitly say it, how that really validates the atheist's point of view. There's something that they're oppressed by that's being hypocritical, that they're like, this whole thing is bunk, because if you agree that the original part is only to get about this manipulative, oppressive part, then we said the whole thing is wrong, right? So there's something in there. I can't formulate it so well right now, but I feel like to honor the atheist point of view, which is so, in certain sense, righteous, trying to be like, we are trying to liberate this from tyranny, is a lot of their motivation.
Yes, to get out of hypocrisy, to get out of corruption, and the challenge there is the same challenge you always have with a dialectic and with negation, which is at the time of the rebellion, the negative looms large and it has to be pushed off. And the positive, I think your point is right on the money. The positive feels like it's an empty rationalization of the negative, right? Peace on earth, goodwill towards men. That sounds great in a different context, but in the context of the Roman Empire taxing your little province out of existence, it's like, it just feels like hypocrisy. And so you reject that as empty hypocrisy along with the corruption itself. And it's not until later that you experience enough problems with your new system that you start to go back and see, what did you throw out that maybe you should have kept and preserved and nurtured? Making the finer distinctions that it wasn't possible to do in the moment when the one thing was preoccupying you. So I like to think about it like this, that as long as genocide remains not just an option, but the mission of countless churches in the modern world, to say their mission is they want to eliminate all of their religions and convert the whole world to their religion. That's genocide. They want to get rid of the other cultures. They believe and this is, Hegel's bad on this, right? Hegel thinks the world needs to become Lutheran or nobody's ever going to be free. And when he says that, my jaw drops and I'm like, Jesus, man, you're genocidal. you're supposed to be better than this, but he can't be, right? This is what he's stuck in at the time. So as long as an atheist's experience of religion primarily consists of running into people trying to convert him, which he can see for the genocide that it is, it's gonna have a hard time focusing on the positive parts of religion that need to be preserved while the negative parts are removed. So I think this isn't about defense or anything. I think it's more about looking at it from the Hegelian perspective. And I think it blends well with what you were saying. Hegel would say they are caught in a labyrinth. And the labyrinth is a necessity in the stages of development of the organism. That's how it moves from one stage to the next. It's through that negation and through that trapped mindset. And it's not going to get out of that mindset until it's finished leaving the old stage and moving into the new stage, at which point it has the leisure to make its own blunders and begin to go, oh, not everything I think is right. I maybe need to look around for some solutions to the problems that clearly I'm the only one creating it. It's not those old guys. I got rid of them. It's now me. I'm the problem. Where do I look for answers? That's when people tend to open up their minds to, yay.
I want to make a quick point that you're making before, and this is the last thing,
Sure.
is that this reminds me of someone who's traumatized by an abuser.
Yeah.
And they're essentially, in the psychological language, as often as it's described, as moving someone in when they're really traumatized, they're in their survival toolkit and they're not in their navigational toolkit. And I think navigational is more like sophrosune, and survival is just like, get me the hell out of here and do anything that you desperately can, like a caged, cornered animal. And I'm wondering if this atheist in this extreme position is really just a survival toolkit, and they're not feeling safe enough to develop something in more of a nullification of the nullification, where then they can grow, yada, yada. So.
Yeah. I where I came around to after my early 20s is the idea that atheism makes a fine stage on the road to something else. And the something else is, okay, so that wasn't the sacred. That was corrupt and rotten. We had to get rid of that. But where are we going next? What does matter? Where do you find value in life? Or in the Nietzschean sense, where does vitality and health lie? Where does sophrosune? And so it's really refreshing to see the Greeks talking about these subjects directly in a way that can be appealing, I think, to somebody who's ready for the next stage. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, I mean, I think actually, I really appreciated Ari's comments, because I think that they were, they really kind of going to help me kind of maybe articulate what I was trying to say a little bit better as well, because this idea as to why we're not questioning our premises is important. Why we're not questioning our underlying assumptions. And one of the things that you had actually mentioned a little bit earlier made me think about it in terms of like our incentives. In economics, there's the idea of externalities, where a third party can actually be impacted by your actions and you don't necessarily care about it, right? So there's an indirect cost that's associated with whatever it is that you're actually doing. And so what this kind of leads to, in a way, is a certain degree of willful blindness. And that willful blindness is that you're looking past purposely because your motivations are purely monetary. And the reason that's important is because then nothing's sacred. And it kind of gets to the idea also of this, what is, some of the pious person versus the impiety. The individuals that are actually, that are, kind of concerned about what is maintaining their own personal character and doing what's right and actually pursuing what is good. But then there are these other individuals and that are not. And what you had said about culture is also important, because you create a culture that actually incentivizes people to essentially, say, abuse the environment per se. And that's something like nature is no longer sacred. So it's this deviation from everything that you actually of what is good that actually tears at the fabric of society. But again, what you start to do is you're not questioning your premise at all, because you're just focused on whatever it is that you have to do in order to make a monetary gain. And I'm not saying that, obviously people need to make a living and things along those lines, and not every, but there's a higher level purpose here that often gets overlooked. So I think that there is a kind of a societal structure that you have in place, and this is where I get, this is where I think modernity is obviously an issue, is that it becomes almost dogmatic in the type of system that it's actually operating under as well. And so the culture aspect of it is lost. And then also your incentive to actually do what's right. So I just found that interesting, and I really appreciated the fact that Ari also brought up the ideas of paradox. I mean, and I think that that's a really important thing, because sometimes, that goes back to what we were talking about last week. You're not just going to reason your way out of it. So, and so that there's something else that is bigger than yourself that you have to kind of adhere to. And so understanding that is, critical, I think, in order for a culture to develop, or essentially, I would say, become more civilized. So, anyway, it's interesting how the piety aspect of it and versus impiety, and anyway, that's a.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, it's the interesting thing about corrupt forms of piety is that they pretend to be piety while actually being impious, because they go through the outward forms of piety that are designed to gain them the social rewards of appearing pious, while actually selling everything out that matters behind the scenes. And so you get this situation with this kind of corruption or hypocrisy where acts of apparent piety can be the least pious acts that happen in the society, because they're more damaging to the sacred. They not only do they not respect the sacred, but they teach other people a frustration with pious acts that makes them not want to engage in real piety, because they mistake it for fake piety. And so you get this sort of embrace of the mundane that can, next thing you know, leads to, genocide, ecocide, whatever. There's all kinds of paradoxes at work with this stuff, and it really gets at why, to the Greeks, this issue of sophrosune and the sacred are so tightly bound to each other and are held as so important, because you get this stuff wrong as a society, you can't really recover from it. I mean, you can't be, if all of your water comes from a certain river, you really can't be dumping your toxic waste into that river where your society's over. That was your only source of water. You're done. And you think about what kind of mindset does it require to get somebody to the stage where they can't tell the difference between eating food and eating poison, where the most important distinctions have become negligible and unimportant distinctions have become everything. This kind of inversion or collapse of values, this is how you get Stephen's centrifugal force operating in a society, so that it starts to come apart. Because even if it wants to stay together, even if it's aligned through a law and order method, still the law and order has them all pointing towards extinction. They're all pointing at doing the wrong thing. So it's interesting stuff, Joe.
It is interesting. And just really quickly, I think you touched on something that was also like what creates the environment where a person is actually going to start to not even be able to tell the difference between, what is good and what is, what's beneficial and what's not. And, kind of this is where I would say hyper specialization and kind of having people look at things in a very narrow perspective. And they're incapable of actually even distinguishing like what their actions are and how they're impacting other people. And so
Right.
that lack of that distinction is it also causes you to not question your premise. So, I mean, you're no longer questioning, you're just doing. And you may even be really good at what you're doing, and you think you can fool yourself into thinking you're talented. And you are to a certain extent. But
Yeah.
if it's totally directed towards the wrong thing, then that's, kind of not going to necessarily result in the outcomes that you would actually hope.
I think about, yeah, that's right. I think about how Aristotle says it's so important to distinguish between a government that has sophrosune from a government that lacks it. He says it's so important that the usual distinction between the rule of one, the rule of a few, and the rule of many is far less important than the distinction, does the government have sophrosune or not? If it doesn't have sophrosune, it doesn't matter whether there's a few of them or a lot of them or just one of them. They're leading you in the wrong direction either way. And so he wants us to use different words. He says a tyranny is not a monarchy, right? Those are two different things. An aristocracy is not an oligarchy. Those are two different things. And I always forget what he put up against democracy. He says democracy is a lot of people who don't have sophrosune voting. But there's another one that he named, which is a lot of people that do have sophrosune voting. He's like, how can you not make the distinction? How can you? It's not even government if they don't have sophrosune, but you're in there using terms that completely erase the distinction. So we're all hyper focused on the thing that doesn't matter and completely oblivious to the thing that does matter. In modern English, we don't have a word for a lot of people who vote but who don't have sophrosune because we don't distinguish that. We don't even have the concept of sophrosune. We think any voting at all by large numbers is good, always leads to good outcomes. That whole concept of what if the majority is corrupted and they vote against each other all the time and tear your society to pieces, which was so obvious to the ancient Greeks, is almost unnameable, unthinkable by us. I was thinking for a moment about mobocracy. Is mobocracy the opposite of democracy? But of course, mobocracy isn't cosmos versus chaos. It's law and order versus chaos. The mob is the group that is irrational and crazy and chaotic from the law and order sense. We're afraid of them voting, but we're not afraid of a lawful large group voting. We think that a lawful large group voting can only produce good results. And in thinking that, we're utterly failing to distinguish between, does that large lawful assembly have sophrosune, or does that large lawful assembly not have sophrosune, which is the only distinction that matters. Are you voting to destroy yourselves, or are you voting to make yourselves healthy? And in modern English, we can't distinguish them. It's the same word. How messed up do you have to be to not have a distinction between food and poison? That's as messed up as you can be. It's a chaos. As an organism, it's a chaos to not know what you should eat and what you should not eat. And that's the level that we operate on politically in the society.
Can I ask a really quick question? Is there an element of Kierkegaard that would be appropriate here, where you're just, the aesthetic life, you're just, kind of just functioning, right? But then how do you transcend that?
Yeah.
Right. Then that's the whole idea of the Knight of Faith, the idea of transcending something bigger than yourself, so to speak.
Yes.
Yeah, that's obviously coming from a Christian perspective, which, okay, we kind of identified that this obviously imposing on cultures is an issue, is a problem, and that's modernity in and of itself. But nonetheless, the bigger point being is that you're appealing to something bigger than yourself, and it's no longer just a stimulus and response. That I'm just responding this is the way this is comfortable.
Yeah.
It's something bigger to think there. I don't know. I just thought about it from that framework in comparing it to kind of what Kenneth is saying.
Yeah. Yeah. The ancients they'd take you to a mystery religion. Come on, let's go to the Eleusinian mysteries. Do some drugs and have a transcendental experience because it disrupts the tidy noesis that keeps people locked in their labyrinth. In the modern world, a less drug-oriented way to do it would be go have a peak experience somewhere do skydiving for the first time in your life, or go to the Grand Canyon and go to the edge and just sit there and eat lunch and look at it. Because big experiences like that they change your understanding of what matters. They change your feeling for what matters, and they make you impatient with the shallow, empty things. I think about that opening of the film Cosmos, where the camera starts at Ellie's window at night and it backs out, and you see the house, and then you see the neighborhood, and then you see the town, and then you see the continent, and then you see the whole earth, and it just keeps going for 5 minutes, backing out past the asteroid belt, the outer planets, the comets, out of our galaxy. It just keeps backing and backing, and in that moment, it just blows your sense of scale out of the water. And that feeling of being connected to the infinite, it does interesting things to the psyche of Homo sapiens. I think Sharon might remember the day that I shared the video from YouTube of the descent into the Mandelbrot set, the fractal. And the camera just went in to the fractal and looked at details. And as we got closer, the details turned out to have details in them. And the camera kept going. It ran for what, 5 minutes? It just went in and in and in. And the complexity never repeated, but was always familiar somehow. And again, that scale shattering sense of, there are deeper things at work here, and we could be connected to them. And we still want to, focus on what Kenneth Smith calls the small change of life. Maybe we get impatient with that and we want to do something that matters. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm just going to counter, the problem with genocide, that the master, Mr. N, would point out that all nature is genocidal. His big point is, it's silly to say that life merely seeks to survive. Ultimately, it seeks to expand. And if that's at the cost of others, too bad. This is a point. They say colonization is evil. All life that I know of, there might be a few forms that don't, but just about all of it colonizes. There was another issue that came up in the meeting after the existentialists, and the atheists were saying, well, you hear all this pot theories. That there's another theory that the religious have some particular gene, and this is the latest little parlor game. Maybe it's true, maybe it isn't. But I remember, I think it was a 19th century philosopher who said that, well, maybe there is no God, but the people that don't believe in a God or something divine or something sacred are sick animals. A healthy animal believes in a God. So by that philosopher's standards, this is what he claimed, all atheists are sickies. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And of course, to that philosopher, I suggest Nietzsche, who says, you're so close, but you're still missing it. It's like, we're all sick animals. Homo sapiens is the sick animal, not just the atheists. When it comes to expansion and being the same as genocide, I've been studying for the last couple of months in great detail the butterflies and plants of the Pacific Northwest, looking at the dependencies among them. And what I'm looking for is, what would I have to put in my backyard if I wanted various species of butterflies to survive there? And I think I've mentioned before, it goes far beyond nectar plants, because if you don't put in host plants for the larvae to feed on, you're never going to get any adults, right? The adults come from somewhere. they come from the larvae, and the plants the larvae eat are usually a different plant than the plants that the adults feed on for nectar. They're usually very different plants. And so there is this invisible connect the dots going on, I think everywhere in the world, but certainly in the Pacific Northwest, where plant species that you would look at them and think, well, these are completely different plants with no relationship to each other. It turns out they have an enormous relationship to each other. It's being generated through the life cycle of these insects as they go through their stages of life. But we can't see it unless we stay there and watch it long enough. And it's not the goal of the butterfly or the larvae to eradicate these plants. If it were its goal and it succeeded at it, then it would die, because most insects are obligates. They absolutely depend on specific species. Those species aren't around, they die. They don't adapt. And because the majority of them don't adapt after billions of years, because their focus is on very specific relationships, one must conclude that Darwin's thing about whoever adapts is better and whoever doesn't adapt is worse is flying in the face of evolution. The evidence before us is that species might adapt slowly over time, but individuals aren't supposed to adapt at all. They're supposed to fit themselves beautifully to their habitat. And the goal would be that they thrive and the habitat thrives, because when the habitat thrives, it creates more resources for the individual to enjoy as well. So there's this feedback loop that goes on. It's why the butterflies are pollinators. They're not just parasites on these plants, they're pollinators on it. And it's interesting how many of the larval host plants don't die. When the larvae are chewing on them, they might lose some leaves, but most of their leaves are fine and they survive, which would be a non-genocidal relationship. So I think what you're describing as colonization and genocide is something we need different words for. It's like, yes, nature does seek to expand. It does seek to grow. That's a critical part of it. And there are ways in which genocide and colonizing have those growing qualities, but they also lack sophrosune because they wreck the environment that was allowing the individual to develop in the first place. There is this other kind of more nuanced thing that we don't have English words for, which is where a kind of commensalism or symbiosis, where you spread in a way that makes things better for you and for the habitat. It doesn't mean there's no conflict, of course. I'm not saying that. As a Heraclitean, Heraclitus would be ashamed of me if I said that. But it means that the conflict is far more interesting and nuanced than, say, what Hitler had in mind. Hitler just wanted to remove the Slavs. He thought he'd have this great eastern frontier if he got rid of all the Slavs. And it's like, yeah, but nature abhors a monoculture, so not a good strategy. You can expand in other ways.
But he was copying the Americans.
Yeah, aping the Americans and went west with the same mindset. Yeah.
Head east, young man.
That's right. So these are really important, interesting things. And when you bring them up, it really underscores for me this issue that if modernity were concerned with sophrosune, with this value system of the ancients, we would have words for these things. We'd be able to distinguish the healthy democracy from the unhealthy democracy. We'd be able to distinguish, healthy colonization from genocidal colonization. But we don't have the words. We don't even have the concepts. And so we find ourselves at a loss trying to communicate on these issues, because there's a kind of weird modernist flatland where the sacred aspects of the discussions have been purged. And I think that's where you get some of the ridiculousness that you see at the things that, Stephen, sometimes you talk about these other ones that you go to where you've got hyper intellectuals doing their thing and thinking that they're saints for being hyper intellectuals. You've got atheists doing their thing and thinking, yeah, all religions are bad. You've got kind of shallow liberals having these very shallow ideas about where productivity comes from, where does health and vitality come from, and so on. And in all of that, I wonder to what extent these are people who might behave and think differently if they were in a culture that had a language that encouraged them to think about these things with depth and nuance. But instead, all they have are these sort of tinker toy words. And so they try to think with those things. And the results, as you point out, are never flattering. It's sort of embarrassing. And I got to think, to some extent, that's got to be my condition in life too. How many ideas are there that are important that I can't even think or express because I lack the words? Phil, you had your hand up. Do you want to go before we wrap up, or did we already say it? You're still on mute. You got to come off mute.
No, that's fine. you ran out of time. So,
Okay.
all right. Thanks.
Well, then we'll hit it next week. But thank you
Where
all.
were we going next week in the text?
Chapter 15, starting with sentence 2.
So this is a thing between private religious observance and being out there in the public.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yes. Very important discussion. And once again, Ari usually says it every week. I'm going to say it. This is the highlight of my week. And thank you all for talking about these things with me. I have a blast doing this with you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rick. This is really top quality for me. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks everyone.
Take care. Have a great week.
Okay, bye.